Silas Cain counted the coins in his palm a third time, not because he didn't know the sum, but because his hands needed something to do while his mind wrestled with what his eyes were seeing. The auctioneer's voice cut through the July heat like a blade, calling numbers over two girls who stood barefoot on a flatbed wagon near the livery fence in Caldwell Flats, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1873. The older one could not have been more than 13, with hair the color of prairie wheat pulled back tight, and a face that had already learned how to show nothing. She held the younger one's hand with a grip that looked more like a lifeline than a gesture of comfort, and she stared straight ahead at a point above the crowd as if she had decided the only thing worth watching was the sky. The younger girl could not have been more than 7, with dark circles under her eyes, and a cloth doll clutched to her chest so worn that its yarn hair had gone thin and patchy. Her bare toes curled against the rough wood of the wagon bed, and she pressed herself against her sister's side, the way a small animal presses against a fence in a storm. Before we go any further into Silas Cain's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away like livestock at an auction block, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to know just how far this story reaches, because this one is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. The auctioneer's voice rang out again. Two girls, orphaned, healthy, no known defects. Younger one's about 7, older's 13, both able-bodied, good for domestic work, farm help, whatever suits your needs, gentlemen. Who'll open at $8? Silas Cain's jaw locked tight as iron. He had ridden into Caldwell Flats the day before to pick up a mule harness and a sack of salt. Had planned to be on his way home before the sun got high. Had not intended to stay overnight, and had certainly not intended to walk into an auction of human beings. But here he stood at the back of the crowd, a man in his 40s with a dusty hat worn low and a canvas vest stained by years of sweat and work, watching something that made the air in his lungs feel heavier than it should. The crowd murmured. A man near the front called out a bid. $8.50. The older girl did not flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on that distant point, her chin raised just a fraction, and Silas saw something in her posture that hit him like a fist to the chest. It was not defiance, exactly. It was the stillness of someone who had already made peace with being unseen. Someone who had learned that hope was a luxury she could not afford. The younger girl turned her face up toward her sister and said something too quiet to carry. The older girl looked down briefly, said a few words back, and then looked away again. The younger one pressed closer. $12, called another voice. Silas's hand tightened around the coins. He did not know these girls. He had no obligation to them. He had a small ranch 9 miles north of town, a dog that was too small to be useful, 3 chickens that barely laid, and a heart that had been quiet for 4 years since the fever took his wife and son in the winter of '69. He had come to this town for harness leather and salt, not for this. But the older girl's expression kept pulling at him. It was an expression he knew from the inside out. It was the look of someone who had survived something and was not sure surviving was worth the price. He had worn that look himself once, long ago, in a different territory, on a day he never let himself remember. $13, the auctioneer said, working the crowd. Going once at 13. Silas's voice came out flat and even, carrying clean across the yard the way a stone carries across still water. $20. The crowd shifted. Heads turned. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence and squinted toward the back. $20 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 22? No one bid 22. The uncle, a man named Harlan Pruitt, straightened from the fence post he had been leaning against, his eyes narrowing. He was heavy through the middle, with dirty stubble and a linen shirt damp with sweat, and he watched Silas approach with the expression of a man who had just realized his arithmetic might need revising. Silas reached the front of the crowd and stopped at the base of the wagon. He looked up at the two girls. The older one, Clara, was looking back at him now, not at the horizon, directly at him, with an expression that was not grateful and not hopeful, and not any of the things a man in his position might have expected. It was wary in the way a cornered animal is wary, measuring him, deciding what kind of threat he was. "I'll take them," Silas said to the auctioneer without looking away from Clara. $20 it is. The gavel came down with a sound like a pistol shot. Silas reached into the inner pocket of his vest and counted out the coins into his palm, then set them on the side rail of the wagon, one by one. He did not hurry. When the last coin was down, he looked over at Harlan Pruitt and said nothing, because there was nothing worth saying to a man like that. Pruitt looked at the coins, then at Silas, and whatever he saw in Silas's face made him decide not to say anything either. He scooped up the coins and walked off toward the saloon without looking back at the girls once. Silas looked up at Clara. "Step down," he said. "I'll help the little one." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said in a voice quieter than he had expected and steadier than it had any right to be, "We don't need your help stepping down, mister." "All right," Silas said. She climbed down herself and lifted her sister off the wagon edge with both arms and set her on the ground. Then she straightened up and looked at Silas with that same measuring, wary expression and said nothing. The crowd was already dispersing. The show was over, and it had been a disappointment. No bidding war, no drama, just a quiet man paying a fair price and walking away with what he had bought. People went back to their business. Silas crouched down so he was level with the little one. She had enormous brown eyes, and she was holding her cloth doll with both arms now, staring at him with an expression that was somewhere between frightened and curious, tilting a little toward curious. "What's your name?" he asked her. She glanced up at Clara. Clara gave a tiny, barely visible nod. "Lily," the little girl said. "I'm Silas." He looked up at Clara. "And you?" "Clara." "Clara," he repeated. "All right. I've got a wagon out front of Fletcher's Supply, about a quarter mile that way." He gestured with his chin. "We'll head out before the sun gets much worse." "Where are we going?" Clara asked. She said it plainly, no fear in the question, but no warmth either. Just a girl who needed information and had decided to ask for it directly. Silas stood. "My ranch, about 9 miles north of here. You'll have a roof and food and your own space. That's what I can offer you right now." "Why?" Clara said. He looked at her. "Why what? Why'd you buy us?" She held his gaze without blinking. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. So why?" Silas was quiet for a moment. It was not the kind of question that deserved a quick answer, and Clara looked like the kind of person who could tell the difference between a real answer and one that had been put together fast to sound good. "Because nobody else was going to," he said finally. Clara stared at him. Something moved through her expression, not softening exactly, more like a careful recalibration, a slight adjustment to whatever model of the world she was working from. Then she said, "You should know I'm not going to be grateful just because you paid money for us." "I'm not asking you to be grateful," Silas said. "And Lily isn't yours to—" "I know that too," Silas said, his voice patient and unhurried. "I'm not your father, and I'm not trying to be. I'm a man with a ranch and more room than I need, and no one to fill it. That's all this is for right now. You can decide the rest as you go." Another silence. Lily had pressed herself against Clara's side and was watching Silas with those brown eyes, the cloth doll tucked under her chin. "What's the doll's name?" Silas asked her. Lily blinked, then cautiously. "Martha." "Martha," Silas said. "That's a good name." Lily looked up at Clara. Clara was still watching Silas, but something had shifted fractionally in her posture, a degree of tension releasing somewhere, like a rope played out a single inch. "All right," Clara said. "We'll come. But if you try anything that ain't right, I'll—" "You don't need to finish that," Silas said quietly. "I mean you no harm, either of you. I give you my word on that." "Your word," Clara said, and the two words came out flat, the way a person says something they have stopped believing in. "My word," Silas said again, just as flat, just as even. "And if I break it, you'll know, and you'll leave, and I won't try to stop you. That's the only guarantee I can give you." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she took Lily's hand and said, "Show us the wagon." The walk to Fletcher's Supply was short and quiet. Silas led, and the girls followed a few feet behind him, close enough that they were with him, but not so close that anyone would have said they trusted him. He did not try to make conversation. He had said what needed saying, and there was nothing to add to it yet. When they reached the wagon, Silas lifted Lily up into the bed without asking and set her down gently among the sacks of supplies. She did not protest. She just arranged herself cross-legged with Martha on her lap and watched him. Clara climbed up on her own and sat beside her sister. Silas checked the mule's rigging, untied the lead, and climbed up to the driver's bench. He took the reins and clicked his tongue, and the mule started forward. They rode out of Caldwell Flats without anyone seeing them off. The town fell behind them, and the land opened up, wide brown grass and limestone ridges, and a sky that went on further than most things. Silas kept the mule at a steady walk and did not say anything for a good while. It was Lily who spoke first. Her voice floated up from the wagon bed, small and matter-of-fact. "Do you have animals at your ranch?" "Some," Silas said. "2 horses, 3 chickens that barely lay anymore, a dog named Hector." A pause. "What kind of dog?" "The kind that thinks he's bigger than he is." From behind him, very quietly, he heard a sound he was not sure he had heard correctly at first. Then he heard it again. A small laugh, quickly muffled. Lily. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the trail and let the sound settle into the air around them. Clara said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, not meant for him, but carrying anyway in the open air. She was talking to Lily, telling her to sit back and not lean over the side. Lily said something back. Clara said, "I don't care, sit back." Lily said something else. Clara said, "Lily Ann, I mean it." There was the sound of small movement and then quiet. Silas kept his eyes forward and said nothing and let the miles go by. The sun was lower, and the heat was easing fractionally by the time the dark outline of his ranch came up on the low hill ahead. The main house, the barn, the fence line of the paddock. Nothing grand, nothing more than what it needed to be, but solid and level and put together by hands that knew what they were doing, which counted for something. He pulled the mule up near the barn and climbed down and came around to help Lily out of the wagon bed. She reached for him this time without waiting for him to offer, which was something. Clara climbed down on her own. Silas carried the supply sacks inside, while the girls stood in the yard and looked around at the property with the particular attentiveness of people trying to figure out whether a place was safe. He did not rush them. When he came back out, Clara was standing with her arms crossed, still doing her inventory of the place. Lily had wandered a few steps toward the paddock fence, where one of the horses, a brown gelding named August, had come over to investigate. "That's August," Silas said. "He won't bite." Lily reached up slowly and touched the horse's nose. August stayed still. Silas looked at Clara. "There's a back room off the kitchen. It's got a cot and a pallet. It's not much, but it's yours. I'll clear out what's in there tonight." "You don't need to do that tonight," Clara said. Her arms were still crossed, but her voice had lost some of its cutting edge. "It's already done," Silas said, which was not strictly true yet, but would be by the time they needed to sleep. Clara looked at him and then looked away, out across the paddock to where the hills began. "You said you've been out here alone," she said. "That's right." "How long?" "Going on 4 years." She was quiet for a moment. "Then how come?" Silas considered how much of that answer to give her. "It's a long story," he said finally. "Longer than we need tonight." Clara nodded like she understood the shape of that, even if not the content. Lily had stepped back from the fence and was looking up at Silas with a question forming on her face. He could see it coming a few seconds before she asked it. "Are you going to be our papa now?" The question hit him square in the chest. He crouched down to her level again, the way he had before, and he picked his words with care. "I don't know what I'm going to be yet," he said. "I reckon we'll have to figure that out together, but I'll tell you what I do know. You're safe here, both of you, and that's not going to change." Lily considered this for a moment with the solemn concentration of a 7-year-old working through a serious problem. Then she looked up at Clara. "He said we're safe," she said. "I heard him," Clara said. "Do you believe him?" Clara looked at Silas. He did not look away from her, and he did not try to make his face do anything in particular. He just let her see whatever she needed to see. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly, "but I'm willing to wait and see." And that was the most honest thing anyone had said to Silas Cain in a very long time. He stood up and looked out over the property and the beginning of the purple dusk beyond the hills. and he thought about how a man's life could turn on a morning he had not expected. How $20 and a moment of recognition could redirect everything. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put something on to eat." Clara took Lily's hand, and they followed him toward the house. And for the first time in 4 years, the sound of footsteps in his yard was not only his own. Hector, the dog who was in fact quite small and had apparently been sleeping under the porch steps the whole time, emerged as they reached the door, took one look at Lily, wagged his tail so hard his whole back half went with it, and shoved his nose into her free hand. Lily made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and bent down and wrapped both arms around the dog's neck. Clara watched her sister for a moment, and Silas watched Clara, and the expression that moved across the older girl's face in that brief, unguarded moment was something so complicated and so old for a 13-year-old that it stayed with him long after the evening had wound down, and the girls were asleep, and the ranch was quiet. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had not yet figured out how to set it down, but had maybe, just maybe, caught the first faint hint that setting it down might one day be possible. He banked the fire in the stove and sat in the chair by the window in the dark and thought about that for a long time. He did not sleep much. Silas sat in that chair until the fire in the stove went cold, and the dark outside the window turned from black to the deep bruised blue that came just before dawn. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet he must have dozed, because he came back to himself with a start when he heard a sound from the back room. Soft, careful, the sound of someone trying not to make noise. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, his hand going to the rifle above the door out of habit, and then he stopped himself. He stood still and listened. It was not the sound of someone in trouble. It was the sound of someone moving with deliberate quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from practice. He crossed the kitchen without lighting the lamp and pushed the door to the back room open by an inch. Clara was standing in the middle of the room with her shoes in her hand. She froze when she saw him. Her eyes went wide for just a half second, the first time he had seen anything like fear in them, and then they went flat and measuring again like a shutter dropping. They looked at each other in the dark. "I was going to the outhouse," she said. Silas looked at her, at the shoes in her hand, at the way she was positioned near the window and not near the door. "Door's that way," he said. Clara did not answer. "You weren't going to the outhouse," Silas said quietly. A silence. Lily was asleep on the cot behind her, curled tight around Martha, breathing slow and even. Clara's jaw tightened. Then, because she was apparently not the kind of person who lied when the lie had already been seen through, she said, "I wanted to know if there was a way out." "Out of what?" "Out of here," she said it plainly, without apology. "In case we needed it." Silas leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and looked at her. He was not angry. He was not offended. He understood the arithmetic of what she had been doing, cataloging exits, mapping escape routes, running the numbers on whether she could get herself and her sister clear if things went wrong in the night. "The window opens," he said. "Drops about 4 feet to the ground. The barn's unlocked, and August is easy to bridle. There's a trail north of the property that cuts through to the Harmon Creek Road." Clara stared at him. "You should know these things," Silas said. "A person ought to know their exits. I'd have told you before you went to sleep if I'd thought to." Her mouth opened slightly and then closed again. She looked down at the shoes in her hand and then back up at him, and for a moment her face was just a 13-year-old girl's face, confused and tired, and young in a way she had been working hard not to show him. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Because it's true, and you deserve to know it." He pushed off the doorframe. "Go back to sleep. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." He went back to his chair and sat down. And after a while he heard the soft sounds from the back room settle into stillness again. He sat with that for a long time. Morning came in hard and bright, the way Wyoming summer mornings do, like someone throwing open a door with too much force. Silas was at the stove when Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair loose and Martha tucked under one arm, blinking at him with the slow, warm confusion of a child who had slept better than she expected. "You're cooking," she said. "Trying to," Silas said. She came further into the kitchen and climbed up onto the bench at the table, set Martha down, and watched him with focused attention. "Clara always does the cooking," she said. "Then Clara can tell me what I'm doing wrong." Lily considered this. "She'll do that," she said. He nearly smiled. Clara appeared a few minutes later, already dressed, her hair pulled back, her face showing nothing of whatever had gone through her in the night. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the skillet and said, "You're burning the fat." "I know," Silas said. "Move it off the heat." He moved it off the heat. She came to the stove without being asked, nudged him slightly to the side with her shoulder, just business, no warmth in it, but no hostility either, and took over the skillet. Silas stepped back and let her. They ate at the table in a quiet that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. Lily ate with the focused seriousness of someone who had not always had enough and intended to make the most of having it now. Clara ate less, watching him whenever she thought he was not looking. "I want to talk about what's next," Silas said when the plates were mostly clear. Clara looked at him directly. "All right. You're going to need clothes, shoes especially." He nodded toward Lily's feet. "I'll take you into Caldwell Flats in 2 days when I've got more cash on hand. In the meantime, there's work on this ranch if you want it, and I'll pay you fair for it. I won't make you work if you don't want to, but I figure you'd rather have something to do." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "What kind of work?" "Feeding the horses, collecting eggs from those useless hens, helping me mend fence line on the north pasture." He paused. "Nothing I'd ask of you that I wouldn't do myself. And Lily?" "Lily can help me with the chickens," he said, "if she wants." Lily's head came up from her plate. "I want," she said immediately. Clara looked at her sister, then back at Silas. "What do you get out of this?" she said. "Out of having us here? What is it you actually want from us?" "Company," Silas said. "That's the honest answer. 4 years is a long time to talk to a mule." It was not funny exactly, but something in Clara's face shifted just slightly. Not a smile, but the shape that comes right before one. The shape that gets stopped before it finishes. "That's a sorry reason to spend $20, she said. "I've spent money on worse," Silas said. They were clearing the table when they heard it, the sound of a horse coming up the trail at a trot. Not a walk, a trot, which was the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and wanted to be there before someone else arrived first. Clara heard it the same moment he did. He saw her body change, a stillness that spread from her shoulders down, the kind of stillness that was the opposite of relaxed. "Inside," Silas said, quiet and even. "Who is it?" "Don't know yet." He was already moving toward the door. "Take Lily to the back room." "Silas!" "Please," he said, and something in the way he said it made her move. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him. It was Deputy Kyle Morrow, riding a gray roan, and behind him, on a second horse, was Harlan Pruitt. Silas's hand stayed loose at his sides. He watched them pull up in the yard, and he kept his face easy, the way you keep a fire easy when the wind picks up, contained, not extinguished. Morrow was a young man for a deputy, mid-20s, with the uncomfortable look of someone who had been told to do something he did not entirely want to do. Pruitt sat behind him with his thumbs in his belt again, and the same flat bored expression from the day before, except now there was something else underneath it, something more careful. "Morning, Silas," Morrow said. He knew Silas by name, which meant they had crossed paths before, though Silas was struggling to place him. "Deputy," Silas said, "got a situation here I need to work through with you." Morrow swung down from the roan and held the reins loose in one hand. "Mr. Pruitt here says there may have been an irregularity with yesterday's sale." Silas looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked back at him without expression. "What kind of irregularity?" Silas said. Morrow pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, a nervous habit of a man saying something he had not fully convinced himself of. "Turns out there was a prior arrangement. Mr. Pruitt says he'd already spoken to a gentleman named Wallace Hatch about taking the girls before the auction was called. That conversation, per Mr. Pruitt, constituted a sale, which would make yesterday's auction unlawful." Silas was quiet for 3 full seconds. "A spoken arrangement," he said. "That's what he's claiming? And where is this Wallace Hatch?" Morrow hesitated. Pruitt shifted in his saddle. "He's in town," Morrow said. "Waiting." "What is Wallace Hatch planning to do with 2 little girls?" Pruitt shrugged, slow and deliberate. "That ain't my business. He paid me fair for them, and I gave my word. A man's word ought to count for something." "Your word," Silas said. "That's right. You gave your word to a stranger over 2 children in your care, the same children you put on an auction block the next morning." Silas's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone very quiet in the way that certain weather goes quiet. "Tell me, Harlan, which word are we supposed to honor here?" Pruitt's jaw moved, but nothing came out. Morrow turned his hat one more time. "Silas, I'm not saying this is right. I'm saying there's a legal question that needs to be answered, and the simplest answer is that you hand the girls over while the matter is looked into. And if it falls in your favor, then—" "They're not going anywhere," Silas said. The yard went very still. Morrow looked at him with something between relief and dread. Pruitt's expression finally showed something, a tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. "Silas," Morrow said carefully, "I'm the law here, and I'm telling you. You're telling me to hand 2 children to a man whose name I don't know, for reasons nobody can explain plainly, based on a spoken word from a man who sold those same children at public auction not 24 hours ago." Silas took one step forward, just one, and his voice dropped another register. "Find me a judge who'll stand behind that, and I'll listen. Until then, those girls stay." A silence stretched out between them. Somewhere behind the house, one of the hens made a complaint about something. Morrow looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the ground. Then Pruitt looked back up at Silas with something new in his expression. Not anger, which Silas could have handled, but calculation. The expression of a man revising his approach. $20 wasn't a fair price for 2 healthy girls, Pruitt said. "A man could argue you took advantage." "A man could argue a lot of things," Silas said. "A man who put his brother's orphaned children on a public auction block might want to think carefully about which arguments he makes out loud." Pruitt's face went red. Morrow put his hat back on. "I'll need to look into this," he said. "I'll be straight with you, Silas. I don't love this situation. But Hatch is a man with money, and money buys patience in this territory. He may push this." "Let him push," Silas said. Morrow nodded once, mounted up, and said something quietly to Pruitt that Silas could not hear. Pruitt looked at the house one more time, and Silas looked back at him without moving. And then Pruitt turned his horse and followed the deputy back down the trail. Silas stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded entirely. Then he turned around. Clara was standing in the doorway behind him. She had heard everything. Her face was white under the summer color in her cheeks, and her hands were at her sides and very still, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her yet. Something cracked open in it, something that had been sealed a long time by necessity, suddenly exposed to the air. "Who is Wallace Hatch?" she said. "I don't know," Silas said, "but I'm going to find out." The next morning came early, the sky still dark along the edges where the hills met the horizon, and Silas Cain was already saddling August by the pale light of a lantern hanging from the barn beam. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times, checking the cinch, running his hand down the gelding's leg to feel for heat or swelling, working through the motions while his mind turned over the name Wallace Hatch like a stone he could not set down. He had not slept more than a few hours, and what sleep he had found had been thin and broken, filled with fragments of the auction yard and the look on Clara's face when she had asked him who was coming for them. He had told her he would find out, and he meant to keep that promise before the day got any older. He led August out of the barn and saw a light on in the kitchen window. Clara was already up. He had not heard her move, but there she was, standing at the stove in the same dress from yesterday, her hair pulled back tight, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the oil lamp. She was not cooking, she was just standing there, watching the door, waiting for him to come in before he left. He tied August to the porch rail and stepped inside to find her with her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the half-light. "You're going to town," she said. It was not a question. "I am. To find out about Hatch." "Yes." She nodded once, a short, sharp motion that seemed to cost her something. Then she said, "What do I do if someone comes while you're gone?" Silas looked at her for a long moment. She was not asking him how to hide or where to run. She was asking him what he trusted her to handle, and that was a different question entirely. He answered it with the truth. You keep Lily inside, you bar the door, and if anyone tries to force their way in, you take the rifle from above the mantel and you use it. You know how? Papa taught me, she said. Good. He picked his hat up from the hook by the door. I'll be back before noon. If I'm not, you do what you need to do to keep yourselves safe. I trust your judgment, Clara. Her face flickered at that. Something passed through her eyes too fast to name, something between surprise and the beginning of something warmer, though she did not let it settle. She just nodded again and said, I'll have coffee ready when you get back. He stepped out into the dark and swung up onto August and pointed the horse toward Caldwell Flats, while the first pale fingers of dawn were just beginning to reach over the eastern ridges. The ride took him just over 40 minutes at a steady canter, the trail winding through sagebrush and dry grass that crackled under the horse's hooves. The air was cool in that way it only is before the sun fully commits to the day, carrying the sharp, clean smell of dust and wild thyme and something older that belonged to the open country itself. Silas let August set the pace and used the time to think. He had been in Wyoming long enough to know that a man like Wallace Hatch, a man with money and a lawyer and an agreement written in the margins of legal gray, did not make idle moves. If Hatch had claimed a prior arrangement with Harlan Pruitt, he had either the documents to back it up or the influence to make documents appear. Either way, Silas needed to know what he was facing before Hatch made his next play. He tied August at the rail outside Fletcher's Supply just as Chet Briggs was unlocking the front door, a ring of keys jangling in his hand, his gray beard catching the early light. Chet was a man of about 65, with the stooped shoulders and sharp eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime behind a counter watching people come and go, and had learned to read them the way a rider reads terrain. He looked up when Silas stepped onto the boardwalk and gave a slow nod of recognition. Silas Cain, Chet said, pushing the door open. You're early. Coffee's not even brewed yet. I didn't come for coffee, Silas said, following him inside. The store smelled of leather and kerosene, and the particular mustiness of goods that had sat on shelves through many seasons. Chet moved behind the counter and struck a match to light the lamp, and the glow pushed back the shadows and revealed the cluttered abundance of bolts of fabric and tin cans and ropes coiled on hooks. No, Chet said, studying him. No, I reckon you didn't. I heard about yesterday at the livery yard. Heard you paid $20 for Pruitt's girls. News travels. News travels faster than a horse in this town, Chet said. And there's something else traveling with it. You've got a name to deal with now. Wallace Hatch, Silas said. Chet's expression did not change, but his eyes did. They went flat and careful in that way a man's eyes do when he is deciding how much to say. He picked up a coffee tin from the shelf behind him and set it on the counter as if buying time. What do you know about him? Silas asked. Chet was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know he came up from Colorado about 2 years ago with more money than a man ought to have without explaining where it came from. He's bought 3 parcels in the basin, one of which has water rights that 2 other ranchers are still fighting in court. He's got a lawyer on retainer and a foreman named Briggs who does the kind of work you don't ask questions about. And I know, Chet paused and looked directly at Silas, that he's been looking for domestic help since his last housekeeper quit back in March. Left without notice, which I never did hear a satisfying explanation for. He wants someone permanent, he said, young enough to train up right. The words landed in the air between them and sat there with weight. Silas let them settle before he spoke. Young enough to train up right. That's what he said. And the girls are 13 and 7. Chet did not answer that. He did not need to. Silas put his money on the counter and picked up a pound of coffee he had not intended to buy, because buying something gave him a reason to have been in the store. Where will I find him this early? Saloon, Chet said. He takes his breakfast there every morning, like he's trying to prove he belongs in a town that doesn't much want him. Silas nodded and turned to leave. At the door, Chet's voice stopped him. Silas, he turned back. That foreman I mentioned, Briggs. He's got a scar runs from his jaw up to his ear. You see him, you watch yourself. He's not the kind of man who talks his way through a problem. Silas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and stepped out into the growing light. The saloon was called the High Timber, and it sat at the far end of Main Street, its false front painted a faded red that had blistered in the sun. Silas pushed through the bat wings and found the place nearly empty at this hour, the air stale with last night's tobacco smoke and the sour smell of old whiskey. A bartender was wiping glasses behind the counter and barely looked up. In the corner, at a table with a ledger open in front of him and a glass of something amber at his elbow, sat a man in a jacket despite the July heat. Wallace Hatch. Silas had never seen a photograph of him, but he knew him immediately. It was in the way he sat, too still, too composed, the posture of a man who had learned that stillness made other people nervous. He was maybe 45, with pale gray eyes and sandy hair going thin at the temples, and he did not look up when Silas approached the table and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited. Hatch looked at him then, not surprised, not annoyed, just looking, the way a man takes inventory of livestock. "Silas Cain," Silas said. "I know who you are," Hatch said. His voice was measured, the voice of someone who had learned to speak slowly because he had found it made other people rush to fill the silence. "Then you know why I'm here. I know you purchased 2 girls at yesterday's auction that Harlan Pruitt had already promised to me." Hatch closed the ledger with one hand and folded both hands on top of it. "I have a signed agreement." "Signed by whom?" "By Pruitt." "And countersigned by?" A brief pause, barely a beat. "The agreement is between myself and Pruitt." "So there's no judge's signature," Silas said. "No territorial seal. No legal witness beyond Pruitt himself." Hatch's expression did not change, but his eyes moved over Silas's face with a new kind of attention. "The legal framework will be established." "I'll be plain with you," Silas said. His voice was low, carrying just enough to reach across the table and no further. "Those girls are not going to you, not today, not through a court, not through any arrangement you make with Pruitt. I will spend every dollar I have and every day I've got left in me to see that through." Hatch looked at him for a long moment, then very slightly he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had played longer games than this and won them. "Mr. Cain," he said, "I admire a man with principles. I find them much easier to work around than a man with cleverness." Silas stood. "You've been warned." "So have you," Hatch said pleasantly, and went back to his ledger. Silas walked out of the saloon with the words still sitting in his chest like a stone he had swallowed. He had come here expecting to gather information, and he had done that. But he had also learned something about Hatch that he had not expected. The man was not bluffing. Whatever he was planning it with the patient confidence of someone who had done this before and knew how the pieces moved. He was halfway back across the basin when the understanding of what Hatch had meant by warned settled into him fully. A man with principles fights on open ground. He announces what he is willing to do and what he will not do, and then he does it. And a man who knows that in advance knows exactly where to apply pressure. Hatch would not come at him directly. He would come at the land, at the resources, at the legal margins where a man without a lawyer could be ground down slowly. Silas pushed August faster, the horse's hooves drumming against the hard-packed trail. He came over the last rise toward the ranch, and the first thing he saw was Clara standing outside the barn door. And the second thing he saw was that she was standing very still in that particular way that meant something was wrong. He was off the horse before it had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard. "What happened?" "Someone was here," Clara said. Her voice was controlled but tight underneath. "While you were gone. About an hour after you left, a man rode up to the fence line and just sat there. He didn't come in. He just looked at the house for a while and then rode off." "What did he look like?" "Big. Dark hat. He had a scar on his jaw. I could see it from the porch." Silas felt the cold settle into his chest. He looked toward the fence line where the trail wound back toward the road. "I kept Lily inside," Clara said. "I told her we were playing a game." "Good." She looked at him with those measuring eyes, and there was something different in them now, something that had shifted in the hours he had been gone. Tell me what you found out." He told her, all of it. Hatch, the agreement, the lawyer, the talk about domestic help. He did not soften it, and he did not rush it, and he watched her face as he talked. She listened the way she did everything, with her whole attention and nothing wasted. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wants us to be servants." "That's what it looks like. Legal servants," she said. "Tied to him. He'd call it something else. He can call it whatever he wants." Her jaw was set like a beam. "I've heard about men like that. Papa talked about it. Said it was bondage with paperwork." Silas looked at her. "Your father was a smart man." "He was," she said, and her voice changed by about 1/4 of a degree, but it did change. "Clara," Silas said, "there's something I need to ask you. Did your father leave any papers? A will? Anything that specified what was to happen to you and Lily if—" "Yes," she said immediately. He stopped. She was looking at him with an intensity that had not been there a moment before. "Papa had a will," she said. "He drew it up the winter before. I know because I heard him and Mama talking about it. He named a man, a preacher named Aldous Webb, had a church in Cheyenne. He said if anything happened, Webb was to have guardianship of us." She looked at Silas steadily. "Harlan never said a word about it. After Mama and Papa died, he just showed up and said we were his now. And I didn't know what the will meant legally. I was afraid if I said something he'd—" She stopped. "He'd what?" She looked at the ground for just a second and then back up. "He hit me the first time I argued with him." The words hung in the air between them. Lily was nowhere to be seen, still inside as Clara had instructed, but the weight of what Clara had just handed him was absolute. Silas stood very still. He let himself feel what he felt, which was a cold, precise anger that he had long since learned to keep from showing on his face, because showing it never helped and containing it usually did. "Once," Clara said, as if she needed him to know the limit of it, "because I asked about the will." "All right," Silas said. His voice was even. "There's a will. That changes things." "Does it?" Clara said. "Aldous Webb is in Cheyenne. The circuit judge isn't due in Caldwell Flats for 3 days." Silas looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I stopped at the deputy's office on my way back through town." She stared at him. "You knew. You already knew about the circuit judge before you left." "I knew a judge was due. Morrow told me yesterday. I was waiting until I had more to tell you before I brought it up." He looked at her. "I know how to think ahead, Clara." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in her, very slowly, like a fist opening one finger at a time, began to ease. 3 days, she said. 3 days. I write a letter to Aldous Webb today. I get it on the post rider. And when the circuit judge arrives, we have something to stand on. Hatch won't wait 3 days. "No," Silas agreed, "he won't." They went inside together. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table with Martha, drawing patterns on the wood grain with one finger. She looked up when they came in and said, "Clara, is the bad man gone?" "For now," Clara said. "Silas," Lily said, turning to him with the directness that only a 7-year-old can manage, "if the bad man comes back, are you going to shoot him?" Silas looked at her. Then he crouched down to her level. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he doesn't get close enough for that to be a question." Lily considered this. "That's not really an answer." "No," Silas said. "I suppose it's not." He found paper and a pen in the drawer by the stove and sat down at the kitchen table while Clara stood watch by the window. He wrote the letter to Aldous Webb by hand, carefully, the way a man writes when he knows every word will be read and weighed. He explained who he was, where the girls were, what had happened at the auction, the claim Hatch had made, the will that Thomas Dowell had left. He asked Webb to come to Caldwell Flats as soon as he could, or to send a notarized statement affirming his guardianship. He signed it and sealed it with wax from the stub he kept in his coat pocket and handed it to Clara. "Can you read it?" he said. She took the letter and read it through. When she finished, she folded it back carefully and handed it to him. "That's good," she said. The post-rider came through at 4 in the afternoon, a lean young man named Jessup who carried mail between Caldwell Flats and Cheyenne twice a week. Silas met him on the road and paid him extra to have the letter delivered express. Jessup took the letter, looked at the address, and said, "This important?" "Life and death," Silas said. Jessup tucked it into his saddlebag and said, "I'll have it there by Friday morning." Silas watched him ride off and stood on the road longer than he needed to, looking at the empty space where the rider had been, feeling the weight of everything now riding on a piece of paper and the speed of a horse. When he got back to the house, Clara had started supper. She was at the stove again, doing it without being asked, moving around the kitchen like she had always been there. Lily was on the floor with Hector, teaching the dog to roll over, which Hector was failing at with great enthusiasm. Silas sat down at the table and watched them for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." She turned. "If Webb doesn't come in time, if Hatch moves before the judge arrives, I need you to know that I will not let them take you. Not without a fight that costs them more than they're willing to pay." Clara looked at him, her hand stilled on the spoon. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if it comes to it, I'll take you and Lily somewhere they can't find you. I have friends in the Northern Territory. It would mean leaving this ranch, leaving everything I've built here. But I didn't build it to keep it. I built it because I didn't know what else to do with myself. That's different now." She did not say anything for a long time. Then she turned back to the stove and said very quietly, "Thank you." It was not the gratitude he had told her he did not expect. It was something quieter and more fragile. A door opened just a crack. That night, after Lily was asleep and the house had gone still, Silas sat in his chair by the window the same way he had the night before. But this time Clara came out of the back room and sat down on the floor across from him, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. "I can't sleep," she said. "Neither can I." They sat in the dark for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the shelf and the occasional creak of the house settling. "Silas," she said. That story you started to tell, about your wife and boy. You said you'd been alone 4 years." He did not answer right away. The darkness made it easier somehow. He could feel her presence across the room, steady and waiting, not pushing. "They died 2 weeks apart," he said. "Sarah went first. Fever. I thought I'd already lost everything when she went. Then Daniel took sick, and I watched him slip away over the course of 8 days, and I couldn't do a thing to stop it. I held him when he went. He was 4 years old." The silence that followed was heavy with something shared and unspeakable. "I didn't think I'd ever want anyone in this house again," he said. "I thought the rest of my life was just going to be me and the horses and the quiet. I was wrong about that." Clara did not say she was sorry. She had said that before, and she was not the kind to repeat herself. Instead, she said, "I think my father would have liked you. Your father never met me." "I know," she said. "But I think he would have." She got up after a while and went back to her room, and Silas stayed in the chair until the clock struck midnight, and then struck 1. He thought about Thomas Dowell, this man he had never met, who had drawn up a will to protect his daughters from a world that failed them anyway. He thought about the letter riding toward Cheyenne, and about Wallace Hatch, and about the 3 days that stretched ahead like a bridge, with no guarantee it would hold. He was still thinking when the first gray light began to seep through the window, and he realized he had been awake the whole night again. It did not matter. There would be time to sleep when this was over. The second day passed like a held breath. Silas worked the fence line on the north pasture, replacing 2 rotted posts and tightening the wire until it sang under his hands. Clara worked beside him for most of the morning, handing him nails, holding the board level, moving with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing useful physical work since she was old enough to be trusted with it. Around mid-morning she stopped and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know. You could rest." "Resting makes it worse," he said. "When you stop moving, you start thinking." She looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them, not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. The recognition of 2 people who had learned the same hard lesson about grief and work. "Yeah," she said, "I know that one." They worked until the sun was high and the heat drove them inside. Lily had been put in charge of the chickens, a task she took with immense seriousness, and reported that 2 of the 3 hens had laid eggs, which she presented with the pride of a general presenting a treaty. At noon, Silas saw the dust on the road. He stood up from the table and walked to the door and watched a single rider approach at a trot. Not a group, just one. He waited on the porch until the rider got close enough to recognize. It was Deputy Morrow. Morrow pulled up in the yard and swung down, his face tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. He walked up to the porch and took his hat off and held it in front of him with both hands. "Silas," he said, "Hatch filed a formal claim this morning." Territorial Magistrate Stover issued an order. "Stover doesn't have jurisdiction over guardianship. He's claiming it does on a technicality," Morrow said. "Says the agreement with Pruitt constitutes a civil contract, not a family matter. He's set a preliminary hearing for tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" Silas's voice was flat. "Tomorrow, at the Land Registry office. Hatch is bringing his lawyer. Stover will hear both sides and make a decision." "That's not enough time. The circuit judge isn't due until the day after." "I know," Morrow's jaw tightened. "I told Stover that. He said he'd rule based on what's in front of him." Silas stood very still. He looked out past Morrow, past the yard, past the fence line, to the place where the road disappeared over the ridge. The letter to Webb was still 3 days out from Cheyenne at best. There was no way a response could reach him in time. "Silas," Morrow said, lowering his voice, "I'm telling you this because I think you should know what you're walking into, and because I haven't slept well since I saw those girls on that platform. I should have done something then. I didn't. I'm not going to make that mistake again." "Then what are you telling me?" Morrow looked at him directly. "I'm telling you that if you need more time, if you need to get them out of here before tomorrow, I will not see what I don't see." It was the most dangerous thing a lawman could say, and Silas heard the weight of it. He looked at Morrow and saw a young man carrying the beginning of a burden that would either crush him or make him into something better. "I appreciate that," Silas said, "but I'm not running. Not yet." Morrow nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. "Then I'll see you at the hearing." He mounted up and rode off, and Silas watched him go. Clara came to the door. She had heard everything through the window. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow." "What do we do?" Silas turned and looked at her. "We get ready." He did not say for what. He did not need to. She already knew. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange quiet. Silas made sure the door bar was solid. He checked the rifle and cleaned it, though it did not need cleaning. Clara packed a small bag with a change of clothes for her and Lily and a few of Lily's things, including Martha. She set it by the back door without saying anything about it, and Silas pretended not to notice. Lily sensed the tension the way children always do, without understanding the cause. She stayed close to Clara, her questions fewer, her voice smaller. She did not ask about the bad man again. She just held Martha and watched. Supper was quiet. Afterward, Clara put Lily to bed and came back out and sat at the table across from Silas. The lamp burned low between them. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "If it goes wrong tomorrow—" "It won't." "Listen," she said, and there was something in her voice, a plea masked as command, that made him stop. "If it goes wrong, I want you to promise me something." "What?" She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Don't make a scene. Don't do something that gets you shot or arrested, or whatever it is that men do when they're trying to be heroes. Because if they take us, and if you're dead, there's nobody left to come get us." The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, this girl who was 13 years old and had already learned to think in exits and contingencies and the arithmetic of survival. He looked at her, and he saw the weight she had been carrying, and he understood that she was not asking him to give up. She was asking him to stay alive. "All right," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded and went to bed. Silas sat alone in the lamplight, turning the rifle over in his hands, and thought about what he would say tomorrow. The morning came in gray and still, the sky the color of old tin, holding the heat close to the ground like a blanket. Silas was dressed and ready before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He had fed the horses and the chickens, had checked the fence line one last time for no reason other than his hands needing something to do. Now he stood on the porch and watched the road, waiting. Clara came out with Lily beside her, both of them in the cleanest clothes they had. Clara had brushed Lily's hair and tied it back with a ribbon that had been her mother's. Lily held Martha tight against her chest. "Are we going to town now?" Lily said. "Soon," Clara said. "Are we coming back?" Clara looked at Silas. He looked back at her. "Yes," Silas said, "we're coming back." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to pet Hector, who had stationed himself at the base of the porch steps, as if he too understood that something was about to happen. They were still standing there when the first horse appeared on the road. Then a second, then a third. Silas watched them come, 3 riders moving at a walk, and he did not move from the porch. He waited until they were close enough to recognize Morrow in front, Hatch behind him, and on the third horse, a man in a dark suit that Silas did not know, but understood immediately, the lawyer. They pulled up in the yard, and Morrow dismounted first. He looked at Silas and said, just above a whisper, "Stover issued the hearing for 10 o'clock. This is Mr. Greer, Hatch's legal counsel." The lawyer nodded, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a tight mouth. Hatch sat on his horse and did not dismount. He looked at Silas and then looked past him at the house, at the girls on the porch, and his expression did not change. He was waiting. 10 o'clock, Silas said. 10 o'clock, Greer confirmed. "I'll be there." Greer nodded and turned his horse. Morrow gave Silas one more look, something complicated in his eyes, and then followed. Hatch stayed a moment longer. "Mr. Cain," he said, "I hope you've had time to reconsider." "I've had time," Silas said. "Nothing's changed." Hatch's smile was thin. "Then I'll see you at 10. He turned his horse and rode off after the others. Silas stood on the porch with Clara and Lily beside him, watching the 3 riders disappear down the trail. The morning was quiet except for the sound of the horses and the distant call of a meadowlark. "It's time," Clara said. "It's time," Silas agreed. He went inside to put on his vest and his hat, and Clara went to get Lily's hand, and together they walked out of the yard and climbed into the wagon that would take them to Caldwell Flats and whatever waited for them there. The wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of 3 anxious souls as it rolled over the rutted trail toward Caldwell Flats, the morning sun climbing steadily into a sky that had gone from gray to a pale washed blue. Silas held the reins loosely in his hands, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his attention was split between the landscape and the 2 girls beside him in the wagon bed. Clara sat with her back straight, one arm wrapped around Lily, her face turned toward the town as if she could already see what awaited them. Lily had fallen into a strange quiet, clutching Martha with both hands, her thumb finding its way to her mouth for the first time since they had arrived at the ranch. Silas noticed but said nothing. He understood that silence sometimes was the only shelter a person had. The town came into view slowly, rising out of the dust like a half-forgotten memory. False front buildings lined the main street, their paint faded and their windows dusty. But there was a quality to the light today that made everything seem sharper, more defined. A crowd had gathered outside the land registry office. Not a large crowd, but enough. 20 or 30 people stood in clusters, their heads turning as the wagon approached, their eyes tracking the 2 girls in the wagon bed with the same uncomfortable curiosity that had marked the auction 2 days before. Silas pulled the mule to a stop near the hitching post and climbed down. He helped Lily out of the wagon, and Clara followed on her own, landing lightly on the packed earth. Deputy Morrow met them at the door of the registry office. His face was drawn, and he held a folded paper in his hand. "Silas," he said quietly, "Magistrate Stover is inside. He's agreed to hear both sides, but he's not inclined to grant continuances. He wants this settled today." "Then we'll settle it," Silas said. Morrow looked at Clara and then at Lily, and something flickered in his eyes. He lowered his voice further. "Hatch has Greer with him. Greer's sharp. He'll try to make this about the contract, not the children. Don't let him steer the argument." Silas nodded once and stepped through the door. The registry office was a single room with a high ceiling and a long table set at the front where the magistrate sat. Judge Stover was a man in his 60s, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too many disputes to be surprised by any of them. He wore a dark coat, despite the heat, and had a stack of papers arranged neatly in front of him. On the left side of the room, Wallace Hatch sat with his lawyer Greer, both of them composed and still. On the right side, Silas took his seat with Clara beside him and Lily on Clara's lap. The room was small, but the weight in it was immense. Magistrate Stover cleared his throat and began without ceremony. "We are here to address a claim filed by Mr. Wallace Hatch regarding the custody of Clara May Dowell and Lillian Dowell, minors. Mr. Hatch asserts that a prior agreement existed between himself and Mr. Harlan Pruitt, the girl's uncle and temporary guardian, for the transfer of custody. That agreement was allegedly superseded by a public auction at which Mr. Silas Cain purchased the girls for the sum of $20. Mr. Hatch seeks to have that auction declared invalid and the girls remanded to his custody." He looked at Silas over the top of his spectacles. "Mr. Cain, do you have legal representation?" "No, sir," Silas said. "I speak for myself and for these girls." "Very well. Mr. Greer, you may begin." Greer rose, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, his voice smooth and practiced. He unfolded a document and laid it on the table. "Your Honor, we have here a signed agreement between Mr. Harlan Pruitt and Mr. Wallace Hatch, dated 3 weeks prior to the auction, in which Mr. Pruitt agreed to transfer custody of the Dowell girls to Mr. Hatch in exchange for a sum of $50, with the understanding that Mr. Hatch would provide them with room, board, and employment. This agreement was executed in good faith and constitutes a binding contract. The subsequent auction was therefore a breach of that contract, and the sale to Mr. Cain is invalid." Silas watched Greer speak, his eyes moving from the lawyer to the document to Hatch's face. Hatch sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, his expression serene. Magistrate Stover took the document and examined it. He turned it over, looked at the date, then looked at the signature. "Mr. Cain, do you have anything to say?" Silas stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to point out 2 things. First, Mr. Pruitt never had legal guardianship of these girls to begin with. Their father, Thomas Dowell, left a will naming a Reverend Aldous Webb of Cheyenne as their guardian. That will is legal and notarized. Mr. Pruitt assumed custody without any legal standing, and therefore any agreement he made was void from the start." Greer interrupted. "Your Honor, the existence of a will has not been established in this proceeding. Mr. Cain has presented no evidence." "The evidence is on its way," Silas said. "I sent a letter to Reverend Webb 2 days ago. He should be here soon." "Soon is not now," Stover said, his voice flat. "I cannot rule on evidence that is not before me. Is there anything else?" Clara shifted beside Silas. He felt her hand on his arm, and he looked down. Her eyes were bright and fierce. "Let me speak," she whispered. He hesitated, then nodded. Clara stood. She was small in that room among the men in their dark coats and their hard faces, but her voice carried clear and steady. "Your Honor, my father, Thomas Dowell, was a good man. He loved us. He made a will because he wanted us to be safe if anything happened to him. He trusted Reverend Webb. He did not trust Harlan Pruitt. Uncle Harlan never even mentioned the will. He just showed up and said we were his, and then he put us on a platform and sold us to whoever would pay." Her voice did not break. She held the magistrate's eyes without flinching. "I'm not a piece of property. My sister is not a piece of property. And that man," she pointed at Hatch, "he didn't come to the auction to save us. He came to buy us because he needed someone to work for him, young enough to train up right." Those were his words. A murmur ran through the small audience that had gathered at the back of the room. Stover looked at Clara, and his expression changed. It did not soften exactly, but it deepened, as if he was seeing her for the first time. "Miss Dowell," he said, "I understand your feelings, but the law deals in documents and signatures. If you have proof of this will, I need to see it." "We have a letter," Clara said. "Silas wrote to Reverend Webb. He's coming. I know he is." Stover looked at the clock on the wall. "I've set aside this morning for the hearing. I cannot wait indefinitely. Mr. Greer, do you have any further evidence?" Greer smiled thinly. "Only the agreement, Your Honor, and the testimony of Mr. Harlan Pruitt, who is outside and prepared to swear that the agreement is genuine." "Then call him in." Pruitt entered, looking smaller than he had at the auction. He avoided Silas's eyes and sat in the witness chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Greer questioned him, and he answered in a monotone, confirming the date, the signatures, the $50. It was all very neat, too neat. Silas stood again. "Your Honor, I'd like to ask Mr. Pruitt a question." Stover nodded. Silas turned to Pruitt. "You say you signed that agreement 3 weeks before the auction. But the auction was held because you said you couldn't afford to keep the girls. If you had an agreement with Mr. Hatch, why didn't you just hand them over? Why hold an auction at all?" Pruitt's jaw worked. "I got a better offer at the auction. $20 is cash in hand. Mr. Hatch's payment was to come later. So you broke your agreement with Hatch because you wanted money faster. And now you're here to testify that the agreement you broke should be enforced." Greer jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Cain is badgering the witness." "He's asking a fair question," Stover said. "Mr. Pruitt, answer it." Pruitt's face reddened. "I don't know. I just did what I thought was right." "Which deal did you think was right?" Silas pressed. "The one you made with Hatch, or the one you made at the auction?" Pruitt said nothing. Stover leaned back in his chair. He looked at the agreement again, then at Pruitt, then at Silas. "Mr. Cain, I'm going to make a ruling. On the evidence before me, I find that the agreement between Pruitt and Hatch is valid on its face. The question of Mr. Pruitt's legal standing to make that agreement is a separate matter. But I have no evidence before me that the will you speak of exists. Therefore, I am inclined to grant Mr. Hatch's claim." Clara's hand tightened on Silas's arm. Lily buried her face in Clara's side. "But," Stover continued, "I will stay enforcement for 48 hours to allow time for this alleged will to be produced. If no evidence arrives by then, the girls are to be remanded to Mr. Hatch's custody. Hearing adjourned." The gavel came down. Silas stood still, the words settling into him like stones. 48 hours. 2 days. The same 2 days he had been counting on, the same window that was already closing. Hatch rose, adjusting his jacket. He looked at Silas and offered that thin smile. 2 days, Mr. Cain. I trust you'll use them wisely." He walked out with Greer, and the crowd began to disperse. Silas stood at the table, his hands flat on the wood, breathing slowly. Clara's voice came from beside him. "Silas?" He turned. She was holding Lily close, her face pale but her eyes still bright. "I'm not going to him," she said. "I don't care what the judge said." "No," Silas said, "you're not." He led them out of the registry office and into the bright July sun. The crowd had thinned, but a few people lingered, watching. He saw May Tilson from the boarding house standing near the steps, and she stepped forward. "Mr. Cain," she said, "I heard what happened in there. If you need a place to stay tonight, my door is open." "Thank you," Silas said, "but we're heading home." "Then take this." She pressed a small cloth sack into his hand. "Bread and cheese. Enough for the ride." Silas took it and nodded. He helped the girls into the wagon and climbed up and took the reins. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the sun high and hot, the dust rising around them in clouds. Lily had fallen asleep against Clara's side, exhausted by the tension she did not fully understand. Clara stared ahead, her face set in a mask that Silas was beginning to recognize as the way she held herself together when she was close to breaking. When they reached the ranch, he helped them inside and built up the fire and put the coffee on. He did not know what else to do. He sat at the table and stared at the wall, turning over possibilities, looking for an angle he had missed. Clara came and sat across from him. "What do we do now?" "We wait," he said. "Webb will come." "And if he doesn't?" Silas looked at her. "Then we do what we have to do." "I told you, I'm not letting them take you." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. That evening they heard horses again. Silas was at the door before the riders reached the yard, his hand resting on the rifle. But when he saw who they were, he let his hand fall. Ed Garnett, his neighbor from 2 miles east, sat on his horse with his wife Ruth beside him on a smaller mare. Behind them came Chet Briggs from the general store and May Tilson again. They pulled up in the yard and dismounted, and Ed walked forward with a look that was part apology and part resolve. "Silas," he said, "we heard about the hearing, we heard about the 2 days, and we came to say we were at that auction. We saw what happened. We didn't speak up then, and we've had to live with it. But we're speaking up now." "What do you mean?" Silas said. "We mean we'll testify at the next hearing," Ruth Garnett said. "About what we saw, about Pruitt, about the way Hatch looked at those girls. We'll stand before the circuit judge and say it." Silas looked at them. 4 people who had been strangers 2 days ago, now standing in his yard, offering to put themselves between a powerful man and 2 children. He felt something shift in his chest. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what to—" "You don't have to know," May Tilson said. "Just let us help." They did not stay long. They had their own homes to tend, their own lives to live. But they left something behind that was more valuable than any document. The promise that Silas was not fighting this alone. That night, after Clara had put Lily to bed, she came out and sat on the porch beside Silas. The stars were coming out, one by one, and the air had cooled enough to carry the smell of sage and dry grass. "Silas," she said. "Yeah, I've been thinking about what happens if Webb doesn't make it." "Don't. Listen," she said. "I know you said you'd take us away, but if it comes to that, I need you to promise me you'll take Lily. I can take care of myself." Silas turned to look at her. Her face was half lit by the lamp from the window, her eyes dark and steady. "I'm not leaving you behind," he said. "You might not have a choice." "There's always a choice." She shook her head. "You don't understand. If they catch us running, they'll hang you. And Lily will be left alone with Hatch anyway. If it's just me, if I stay behind, you can get Lily to safety, and then you can come back for me. Clara, promise me." He looked at her for a long time. The stars wheeled overhead, and the nightbugs sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out once and went silent. "I promise I'll get you both out," he said. "That's the only promise I'm making." She looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his voice stopped her. She let out a breath and leaned back against the porch post, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the yard. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said very quietly, "I hope your Reverend Webb rides fast." The morning of the second day arrived in a haze of heat and anxiety. Silas was up before dawn, working the horses, feeding the chickens, doing anything to keep his hands busy. Clara was up shortly after, and together they went through the motions of breakfast without really tasting it. Lily sensed the tension and stayed close, her questions fewer, her voice smaller. Around 10 o'clock, Silas saw a rider coming up the trail. He stood on the porch, his heart pounding, his eyes straining to identify the figure. As the rider got closer, he saw it was not Webb, it was Deputy Morrow. Morrow pulled up in the yard and swung down, his face grim. "Silas, I've got news." "What kind of news?" "Hatch filed a water rights claim against your property this morning. He's using it as leverage. Says if you drop the custody fight, he'll withdraw the claim. If you don't, he'll tie your land up in court for a year." Silas felt the words land like a blow. He had known Hatch would use every weapon he had, but this was faster than he had expected. "He's doing it to push you out," Morrow said. "To make you choose between the girls and the ranch." "I already made that choice," Silas said. "I made it the moment I stepped into that auction yard." Morrow looked at him and nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. I just wanted you to know what you're facing." "I appreciate it." Morrow mounted up. "Judge Fitch arrives tomorrow. He's the circuit judge. If you can get Webb here by then, you've got a chance." "I know." Morrow rode off, and Silas stood in the yard, staring at the dust settling in his wake. Water rights. The lifeblood of a ranch. Without them, the land was worthless. He would lose everything he had built over 4 years of solitary work. He walked to the house and told Clara. She listened without interruption, her face unreadable. "Are you going to give in?" she said. "No." "Then what are we going to do?" "We're going to wait for Webb. And if he doesn't come, we ride out tonight. North. There's a settlement called Hardin's Crossing. I know people there. They'll take us in." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. "And if they catch us?" "They won't." She nodded. Then she went inside to pack. The afternoon stretched out, each hour longer than the one before. Silas worked in the barn, checking the horses' shoes, making sure the saddle was ready. He did not know if he would need to ride tonight, but he wanted to be prepared. At 4 o'clock, he looked up from the workbench and saw another rider on the road. This one was moving at a canter, raising a plume of dust. Silas stepped out of the barn and watched. The rider was a man in a dark suit, covered in dust, his hat pulled low. He rode straight up to the yard and reined in, and when he lifted his head, Silas saw a face lined with exhaustion and relief. He was about 50, with a preacher's collar visible under his coat and a look of urgency in his eyes. "Are you Silas Cain?" the man said, swinging down from the saddle. "I am. My name is Aldous Webb. I got your letter. I rode through the night." Silas felt something break open in his chest. He grabbed Webb's hand and shook it hard. "You came. I told you, Thomas Dowell was my closest friend. I would have crossed a desert to get here." Webb looked toward the house. "Are they inside?" "They are." Webb walked to the porch, and the door opened before he reached it. Clara stood in the doorway, Lily behind her. She looked at the man in the dark suit, and something in her face crumbled. "Reverend Webb?" she said. "Hello, Clara." Webb's voice cracked on the words. "You look so much like your mother." Clara stepped forward, and then she was in his arms, and for the first time since Silas had known her, she let herself cry. Lily came out slowly, clutching Martha, looking up at the stranger with wide eyes. Webb knelt down and looked at her. "Lily Ann," he said, "I've known you since you were a baby. I held you at your christening. You don't remember me, but I remember you." Lily studied him for a long moment. Then she held out Martha. "This is Martha," she said. Webb took the doll with immense tenderness. "Hello, Martha. I'm pleased to meet you." Lily smiled. It was a small smile, fragile, but it was real. They went inside, and Webb sat at the table and spread out the papers he had brought. The will, the notarization, a letter from the Cheyenne Circuit Court confirming his guardianship. It was all there. Every document that could have saved them 2 days earlier, now here, just in time. "The hearing is tomorrow at 9, Silas said. "I'll be there," Webb said. Then he looked at Silas with an expression that carried the weight of more than a journey. "You've done something extraordinary, Mr. Cain. Thomas would have thanked you. I'm thanking you now." Silas shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Webb said. "That's why it matters." The evening was filled with a cautious hope. Clara helped prepare supper, and Webb talked about Cheyenne, about the church, about the years he had known Thomas and June Dowell. He told stories that made Clara laugh, a sound Silas had never heard from her before, and Lily listened with rapt attention. It was the most alive the house had felt in years. But Silas did not let himself relax. Hatch still had 1 day left, and a man like Hatch did not give up easily. He had filed a water rights claim. He had a foreman with a scar. He had leverage that went beyond the courtroom. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Silas sat by the window with the rifle across his lap. He did not sleep. He watched the dark line of the trail and listened to the wind, waiting for the sound of horses that never came. But he knew they would come. They always did. And when they came, he would be ready. The morning broke clear and hot, the sun already throwing long shadows across the yard before Silas had finished saddling August. He worked with a quiet efficiency born of too many sleepless nights, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind ran ahead to the circuit courthouse, to Judge Fitch, to the papers that Aldous Webb had laid out on the kitchen table the night before. The will, the notarization, the letter from the Cheyenne court. It was all there, every piece of evidence they needed, and yet Silas could not shake the feeling that something was still wrong. He had learned to trust that feeling over the years, that prickle at the back of his neck that told him the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as it looked. Aldous Webb came out of the house, his collar already buttoned despite the heat, his face lined but steady. He carried a leather satchel with the documents inside, held close to his chest like a shield. "I've prayed over this, Mr. Cain," he said. "I believe the Lord brought me here in time." "I hope you're right," Silas said. Clara appeared in the doorway with Lily's hand in hers. She had braided Lily's hair and tied it with the same ribbon from her mother, and she wore the dress that May Tilson had brought over days ago. Her face was composed, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning the yard, the road, the horizon, as if she expected trouble to rise up from the dust itself. "Ready," she said. Silas helped Lily into the wagon, and then turned to Clara. She looked at him for a moment, and he saw something in her expression that he could not quite name. It was not fear, not exactly. It was the look of someone who had learned to expect the worst and had built her courage around that expectation. "We're going to win today," he said. She did not answer. She climbed into the wagon and sat beside her sister, and Silas took the reins. The ride to Caldwell Flats was quieter than the one 2 days before, but the silence was different. It was not the silence of dread. It was the silence of a held breath, of people waiting for a door to open. Webb rode beside the wagon on his borrowed horse, his satchel secure, his eyes fixed ahead. The town was already stirring when they arrived. The heat had driven most people indoors, but a cluster of men stood outside the land registry office, and Silas recognized Ed Garnett among them. Ed stepped forward as the wagon pulled up, Ruth beside him, and behind them stood Chet Briggs and May Tilson. "Silas," Ed said, "we're here. Whatever you need." Silas nodded. He could not find the words to express what he felt, so he just nodded and helped the girls down. They entered the registry office, and the room was already full. Judge Fitch sat at the front table, his heavy frame settled into the chair with the permanence of a man who had presided over 100 such disputes. He had gray hair and a gray beard, and eyes that had seen every shade of human failing. On the left side of the room sat Wallace Hatch, and beside him was a new lawyer, a younger man with a sharp jaw and restless hands. Greer was nowhere to be seen. Magistrate Stover sat off to the side, relegated to an observer's role now that the circuit judge had arrived. Judge Fitch looked up as Silas and Webb entered with the girls. He did not smile, but he did not frown either. He simply observed, taking in the room with the patience of a man who knew that the truth would eventually surface if he waited long enough. "Let's begin," he said. Webb stepped forward. "Your Honor, I am Reverend Aldous Webb of Cheyenne. I have known Clara and Lily Dowell since they were born. I was their father's closest friend, and I hold the legal guardianship granted in his will." He opened his satchel and laid out the documents across the table. The will, the notarization, the letter from the Cheyenne Circuit Court. Fitch picked them up one by one, reading each with careful attention. The room was so quiet that Silas could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. After a long moment, Fitch set the papers down and looked at Hatch's lawyer. "Mr. Vance, do you have anything to say?" The young lawyer, Vance, stood. He had a voice that was smooth and practiced, the voice of a man who had learned to make the truth bend without breaking. "Your Honor, we do not dispute the existence of this will. However, we argue that Mr. Cain's acquisition of the girls at auction was itself irregular. The auction was conducted by a man with no legal standing, and therefore the sale is void. The girls should be remanded to Mr. Hatch, who had a prior agreement with Mr. Pruitt, or, at minimum, placed in territorial custody until the guardianship can be properly transferred to Reverend Webb." Judge Fitch looked at Vance over his spectacles. "You want me to invalidate the sale but honor the prior agreement that was made by the same man who had no legal standing." "The prior agreement predates the auction, Your Honor. It was made in good faith." "Good faith," Fitch repeated, and the words hung in the air like smoke. He turned to Silas. "Mr. Cain, what do you say?" Silas stepped forward. "Your Honor, I paid $20 for these girls at a public auction. I didn't know about the will. I didn't know about Mr. Hatch. All I knew was that 2 children were being sold like livestock, and nobody else was going to stop it. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the fine points of territorial law. But I know right from wrong, and there is nothing right about handing these girls to a man who described them as young enough to train up right." A murmur ran through the room. Clara's hand tightened on Lily's shoulder. Judge Fitch looked at Hatch. "Mr. Hatch, is that accurate?" "Did you use that phrase?" Hatch smiled, thin and practiced. "I may have said something to that effect. I was referring to domestic training, Your Honor. I run a household. I need staff who can learn the work. And you were willing to pay $50 for the privilege of training 2 girls, aged 13 and 7, as domestic staff. $50 is a fair price for—" "It's not a price at all," Fitch interrupted, his voice sharp. "It's a purchase, and I don't purchase human beings in my courtroom." The room went still. Hatch's smile faded. But Vance was not finished. "Your Honor, even if the court finds the prior agreement questionable, the fact remains that the auction was illegal. Mr. Cain has no legal claim to the girls either. The proper course is to place them in temporary custody of the territory until Reverend Webb's guardianship can be formally transferred. That process will take several weeks. Silas felt the ground shift beneath him. Several weeks. Weeks in which Clara and Lily would be wards of a territory that had no real interest in them. Weeks in which Hatch could maneuver, could file appeals, could find ways to delay and obstruct. Judge Fitch sighed. He looked at the documents again, then at Clara, who was watching him with those steady, unflinching eyes. "Miss Dowell," he said, "do you have anything you want to tell me?" Clara stepped forward. She did not look at Hatch. She looked only at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "my father trusted Reverend Webb. He made a will so that we would be safe. We have been safe at Mr. Cain's ranch. He has not hurt us. He has not tried to sell us. He gave us a room and food, and told us we could leave if we wanted to. I don't know what happens in territorial custody, but I know what happens when a man like Mr. Hatch buys a girl for $50. I've heard stories. I've seen the way he looks at children." Her voice did not waver. She spoke like a woman twice her age, and the room listened. Judge Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Vance. "Mr. Vance, if I order temporary territorial custody, where will the girls be housed?" "The county has a foster arrangement with a Mrs. Elsie Trimble on the east side of town," Vance said. "I know Mrs. Trimble," May Tilson spoke up from the back of the room. "She runs a boarding house for drifters. She's a good woman, but she doesn't have room for 2 children. They'd be sleeping in the common room." Judge Fitch's eyebrows rose. "Is that true, Mr. Vance?" Vance hesitated. "It's a temporary arrangement, Your Honor." "No," Clara said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "No, I'm not sleeping in a common room. I've done enough of that. My sister and I are not going to be passed around like baggage." "Miss Dowell," Fitch said gently, "I understand your—" "With respect, Your Honor," Webb said, stepping forward, "I am the legal guardian. I am here now. The transfer of guardianship can be completed today. I have the documents. I have the notarization. There is no need for territorial custody. The girls can come with me to Cheyenne immediately." Silas felt his heart drop. He had not considered that possibility. If Webb took them to Cheyenne, they would be safe from Hatch, but they would also be gone. The house would be empty again. The quiet would return, and Silas would be alone with the horses and the chickens, and the memory of a girl named Clara, who had taught him what it meant to care again. He looked at Clara. She was looking at Webb, her expression unreadable. "That's an option," Judge Fitch said slowly. "Reverend Webb, are you prepared to take custody today?" "I am," Webb said. "I have a home in Cheyenne, a congregation that will welcome them. I can provide for them." Clara did not speak. She looked at the floor, then at Silas, and he saw something in her eyes that he could not interpret. But before anyone could say another word, the door of the registry office burst open, and Harlan Pruitt stumbled in, his face red, his eyes wild. He was breathing hard, and he looked like a man who had been running. "Your Honor," he said, gasping, "I need to say something." Judge Fitch's face hardened. "Mr. Pruitt, this hearing is already in progress. You were not called." I know, but I need to say it now or I won't be able to live with myself." Pruitt's voice cracked. "That agreement with Hatch, it wasn't signed 3 weeks ago. I signed it yesterday. He paid me to backdate it. He threatened me. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't. He said he'd take my land." The room erupted. Vance shouted an objection. Hatch stood up, his face white. Judge Fitch pounded his gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" Silas stood frozen, watching Pruitt spill the truth in a flood of desperate words. He had been bribed. He had been threatened. The agreement was a forgery. Hatch had been planning this for weeks. When the room finally quieted, Judge Fitch looked at Hatch with eyes that had gone cold. "Mr. Hatch, is this true?" Hatch's composure had cracked. His hands were shaking, but he tried to smile. "Your Honor, this man is a liar and a drunk. He'll say anything to save himself." "Then let's see the ink," Fitch said. "Mr. Vance, I want that document examined by an expert. The ink on a 3-week-old signature dries differently than ink on a 1-day-old signature. We'll know by morning." He looked at Hatch. "In the meantime, I'm ordering you to remain in Caldwell Flats. You will not approach the Dowell girls or Mr. Cain's property. Is that understood?" Hatch said nothing. His face had gone gray. Judge Fitch turned to Webb. "Reverend, the girls will remain with Mr. Cain for now, under your guardianship, until this matter is fully resolved. I'll issue a temporary custody order placing them in Mr. Cain's care pending a final hearing in 2 weeks. Does that satisfy you?" Webb nodded. "It does, Your Honor." "Then we're adjourned until I have the ink analysis." Fitch stood and left through the side door, and the weight of the room seemed to lift. Silas let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Beside him, Clara's shoulders sagged, just a fraction. Hatch left quickly, his lawyer following, not looking at anyone. Pruitt stood in the corner, looking hollow and broken. Silas looked at Clara. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she repeated. And then, for the first time, she smiled. It was small and tentative, like the first crack of light under a door. But it was real. They walked out into the July sun, and the town seemed brighter than it had before. Ed Garnett clapped Silas on the shoulder. May Tilson hugged Clara, who allowed it. Webb stood with his satchel, looking tired but relieved. "We've bought ourselves time," Webb said, "but Hatch won't give up. He'll find another angle." "Let him," Silas said. "We'll be ready." But as they climbed into the wagon and started the ride back to the ranch, Silas could not shake the feeling that the storm was not over. Hatch had been caught in a lie, but a man like that did not simply disappear. He would regroup. He would find another way. And Silas knew, deep in his bones, that the next move would not come in a courtroom. It would come in the dark. The ride back to the ranch was slow and silent, the wagon wheels grinding through the dust, the sun beginning its long descent toward the western ridges. Silas held the reins loosely, his shoulders aching with a tension that had not fully released even after Judge Fitch's ruling. 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks before the final hearing, and while the ink analysis would likely destroy Hatch's forged agreement, Silas knew better than to trust in a victory that had not yet been sealed. He had seen men like Hatch before, men who lost battles but won wars by wearing down their opponents through attrition, through legal fees, through the slow grind of a system that favored those with money and patience. Beside him on the bench, Clara sat with Lily curled against her side, the little girl's eyes half closed in the heat. Webb rode alongside on his borrowed horse, his satchel secure, his face thoughtful. He had not said much since the hearing, and Silas respected the silence. There would be time for talking later. The ranch appeared on the low hill ahead, the house and barn casting long shadows across the yard. Hector came bounding out from under the porch, his tail a blur of welcome, and Lily perked up at the sight of him. "Hector!" she called, and the dog ran in circles around the wagon as Silas pulled to a stop. They went inside, and Silas built a fire in the stove while Clara set out the remains of the bread and cheese from May Tilson. Webb sat at the table, spreading out his documents again, though he did not look at them. He looked at Silas. "Mr. Cain," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." Silas turned from the stove. "Ask." "I saw the way Clara looked at you in that courtroom. I saw the way she stood beside you. She trusts you. That is not something Clara gives easily." Webb paused. "I came here prepared to take them to Cheyenne. I still have that obligation. But I'm asking you, as a man who knew Thomas Dowell, as a man who loved those girls like his own, do you want them to stay?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Clara, who had stopped moving, her hand frozen over the bread, her eyes fixed on him. Lily was on the floor with Hector, oblivious to the weight of the question hanging in the air. "Reverend," Silas said, "I have not let myself want anything in 4 years. Not really. After Sarah and Daniel died, I shut that part of me down. I told myself it was easier that way, safer." He looked at Clara. "But then I saw her standing on that wagon, barefoot, not crying, not begging, just standing there like she had already decided no one was going to save her and she was going to face it alone. And I could not walk away from that. I cannot walk away from it now." Clara's hand lowered. She did not speak, but something shifted in her face, a loosening of the tightness that lived behind her eyes. Webb nodded slowly. "Then I think we need to talk about what happens next." They talked late into the evening, the lamp burning low, the shadows deepening around them. Webb explained that the transfer of guardianship could be done formally with Judge Fitch's approval, but that it would require Clara and Lily to be placed in a stable home. The court will want to see that they have a permanent guardian, not a temporary arrangement. If you want to keep them here, Mr. Cain, you will need to be named as their guardian, or at least as their custodian under my authority. I'll do whatever it takes, Silas said. It will mean paperwork, court appearances, possibly a home inspection. Then let them inspect, Clara spoke up. What about Hatch? He's not going to just disappear. He won't, Webb agreed. But with the forged agreement exposed, his legal standing is gone. The water rights claim will take months to resolve, if it even holds up. His main weapon now is intimidation, and that means we need to be watchful. Silas looked at the window. The night had fallen fully, the yard dark and still. I'll be watchful, he said. That night, after Webb had retired to the spare pallet in the back room and Lily was asleep, Clara came out to the porch where Silas sat in the dark. She did not say anything at first. She just leaned against the post beside him and looked out at the stars. Silas, she said. Yeah. Reverend Webb asked me today, before the hearing, what I wanted. Whether I wanted to go to Cheyenne with him. Silas waited. I told him I didn't know. She paused. That was a lie. I knew. I just didn't know how to say it. Silas looked at her. In the dim light, her face was a study in contradictions. Young and old, hard and soft, wary and hopeful. What did you know? He asked. She turned to face him. That I didn't want to leave. That for the first time since Mama and Papa died, I felt like I could breathe. Like I didn't have to watch every shadow. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a place I could belong. She looked away. I know it's only been a few days. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's true. Silas felt something move deep in his chest, something that had been frozen for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to thaw. It makes sense, he said, more than you know. They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds washing over them, crickets, the distant call of an owl, the soft breathing of the horses in the barn. Then Clara said, I'm going to stay up for a while. You should get some sleep. I'll sleep when this is over. She smiled, just a little. That's what I said about Uncle Harlan's house. I didn't sleep for 2 weeks. And you slept here? Yes. She looked at him. I slept here. She went inside and Silas stayed on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the weight of the days ahead pressing down on him. But underneath that weight, there was something else, something that felt almost like hope. The next morning, Webb left for Cheyenne to file the formal guardianship documents and to arrange for the transfer of authority. He promised to return within a week. Keep them safe, Mr. Cain, he said as he mounted his horse. I'm trusting you with the most precious thing Thomas Dowell ever had. I won't let you down, Silas said. Webb rode off, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that was both strange and familiar. Clara took over the cooking without being asked, and Lily took over the chickens, reporting each egg with the gravity of a military dispatch. Silas worked the fence line, repaired a loose board on the barn, and tried to keep his hands busy while his mind kept circling back to Hatch. 2 days passed without incident. On the third day, Silas rode into Caldwell Flats to pick up supplies and to check on the progress of the ink analysis. He found Deputy Morrow at his office, looking tired but relieved. Ink analysis came back this morning, Morrow said. The signature on the agreement was less than a week old when Pruitt brought it in. The judge has ruled the agreement fraudulent. Hatch has been fined and ordered to pay court costs. He's also been warned that any further attempts to claim the girls will result in charges of attempted kidnapping. Silas felt a weight lift. So it's over? Morrow hesitated. The legal part mostly. But Silas, Hatch is not a man who takes losses well. He's still in town. He's still got his foreman, and he's still got that water rights claim, which he can drag out for months. I'd keep your guard up. I always do, Silas said. He bought his supplies and headed back, the news sitting uneasily in his chest. He had won the battle, but the war might still have casualties. He was halfway home when he saw the smoke. It was thin and gray, rising from the direction of his ranch, and his heart stopped. He kicked August into a gallop, the horse's hooves pounding the trail, the supplies bouncing in the saddlebags. He crested the last ridge and saw the source of the smoke, the henhouse. It was burning, flames licking at the dry wood, a figure standing near the fence line watching. Silas pulled August up hard and dismounted before the horse had stopped. He ran toward the henhouse, but it was too late. The flames had taken hold, the roof collapsing inward with a roar. He grabbed a bucket from the barn and threw water on the fire, but it was a gesture, not a solution. The henhouse was gone. He stood panting, the heat washing over him, and looked at the figure at the fence. It was the foreman, Briggs, the scar on his jaw vivid in the firelight. He was mounted on a black horse, and he was smiling. "Message from Mr. Hatch," Briggs said. "He says next time it won't be a chicken coop." Silas took a step toward him, his hand going to the rifle on his saddle. Briggs laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and turned his horse and rode off at a canter, disappearing into the dusk. Clara came running from the house, Lily behind her. "Silas, what happened?" "Hatch," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, but his hands were shaking. "He burned the henhouse." Clara looked at the smoldering ruins, then at the empty trail where Briggs had vanished. Her face was pale in the fading light, but her voice was steady. "The chickens? Didn't make it." Lily started to cry, a quiet, hopeless sound that cut through Silas like a blade. Clara gathered her sister into her arms and held her tight, and they stood together in the yard, watching the last of the flames die down. Silas walked to the fence and looked out at the darkening hills. Hatch had made his move. It was not a legal move, not a move that could be countered with documents and testimony. It was a move of pure intimidation, designed to show Silas that no one was safe, that no boundary would be respected. He stood there for a long time, the anger building in him like a slow fire. Then he turned and walked back to the house. "We're not going to run," he said to Clara, "and we're not going to hide. We're going to stay, and we're going to fight. But I need you to understand what that means. It means there might be more nights like this. More mornings with something broken or burned." Clara looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "We're not leaving." "I know," he said. "I just needed to hear you say it." That night, he did not sleep. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees, watching the trail, waiting. The smoke from the henhouse drifted across the yard, acrid and bitter, a reminder that the world was not safe, that safety was something you had to build with your own hands and defend with your own will. But as the hours passed and the stars wheeled overhead, he felt something he had not expected. Not fear, not anger. A quiet, stubborn certainty. He had lost his wife. He had lost his son. He had lost 4 years to grief and solitude. But he was not going to lose these girls. Not to Hatch, not to the law, not to anything. He would burn this whole territory down before he let them be taken. And somewhere in the darkness, he knew that Wallace Hatch would learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, they buried what was left of the chickens. 3 small bodies, wrapped in cloth, laid in a grave near the fence line. Lily said a prayer that Clara had taught her, her voice trembling but clear. "God, please take care of our chickens. They were good chickens. Amen." Silas filled in the grave and stood there with his hat in his hand, looking at the small mound of earth. He had buried so many things over the years. He was tired of burying. He was about to turn back to the house when he saw the dust on the trail. A single rider, coming fast. He reached for the rifle, then stopped. The rider was too small, too slight. It was not Briggs. The rider pulled up in the yard, and Silas recognized the young man from the post office. Jessup, the mail rider. "Mr. Cain," Jessup said, breathing hard. "I've got a telegram for you. Came through from Cheyenne this morning." Silas took the paper and read it. The words blurred for a moment, and then they came into focus. "Arriving tomorrow, stop. Have evidence Hatch criminal background, stop. Do not confront alone, stop. Webb." Silas read it twice. Criminal background. Webb had found something that could end this for good. He folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. Clara came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes questioning. "What is it?" "Webb's coming tomorrow. He's got evidence. Something about Hatch's past." Clara's eyes widened. "What kind of evidence?" "I don't know. But it might be enough to finish this." He looked at the hills, at the road where the smoke had risen the night before, at the grave of 3 chickens that had died for no reason except cruelty, and he felt something shift inside him, a turning, a readiness. "One more night," he said. "We just have to get through one more night." Webb arrived just past noon, his horse lathered and blowing, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with purpose. He swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped and grabbed his satchel from the saddlebag with both hands, holding it against his chest like a man carrying something that could not be dropped. Silas met him at the yard, Clara a step behind, Lily watching from the doorway with Hector at her feet. "Mr. Cain," Webb said, his voice hoarse, "I found it. I found everything." They went inside, and Webb spread the contents of the satchel across the kitchen table. There were letters, court documents, newspaper clippings, and a deposition signed by a territorial judge in Colorado. Silas picked up the deposition and read it while Webb talked, his words tumbling out in a rush. Wallace Hatch left Colorado 2 years ago under a cloud that most people chose not to look too closely at. He had been running a boarding house outside of Durango that took in orphaned children, wards of the territory, children whose parents had died in mining accidents, children with no one to speak for them. He called it a home for the destitute. It was a labor camp. He worked them 12 hours a day, fed them on scraps, and when one of them died of fever, he buried the child in an unmarked grave and told no one. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Lily had come closer, drawn by the intensity of the adults' voices, and Clara pulled her against her side, shielding her from the words. "When the truth came out," Webb continued, "a judge ordered an investigation. But Hatch had friends in the territory, men who owed him favors, and he was warned before the warrant could be served. He fled north, leaving behind a trail of debts and broken promises, and one child who had been found wandering the streets after his escape, unable to speak for 3 days." Silas set the deposition down. His hands were steady, but his voice was low and hard. "Why didn't anyone follow him?" "Because he changed his name," Webb said. "He was born Wallace Hatch, but in Colorado he used an alias, Harold Mackey. By the time the authorities realized the connection, he had already established himself here in Wyoming, and the Colorado case had run out of funds and urgency. The judge who issued the warrant died of a heart attack 6 months later, and his successor had no interest in pursuing a case across territorial lines. But you found it." "I found it because I knew where to look. I spent 3 days in Cheyenne going through old telegrams and court records. A clerk remembered the case, remembered the name Mackey, and put the pieces together for me." Webb pulled out a folded paper. "This is an affidavit from the Colorado judge's clerk confirming that Hatch and Mackey are the same man. And this," he laid down another document, "is a letter from the Colorado territorial attorney stating that if Hatch is apprehended, they will extradite him to face charges." Silas looked at the documents. He felt the weight of them, the accumulation of years of cruelty and evasion, all now laid out on his kitchen table. "Judge Fitch needs to see this," he said. "I already sent word to him," Webb said. "He's agreed to hold an emergency session at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Silas nodded. He looked at Clara. She was pale, but her eyes were sharp and focused. "We're going back to town," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm ready." The ride to Caldwell Flats was brisk, the afternoon sun beating down on them as they drove the wagon through the dust. Webb rode alongside, his satchel secure, his face set with determination. Clara sat with Lily in the wagon bed, her arm around her sister, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The registry office was already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread, and the town had turned out to see the conclusion of the drama that had gripped Caldwell Flats for the past week. Judge Fitch sat at the front table, his expression unreadable. Morrow stood near the door, his hand resting on his holster. And in the corner, seated alone, was Wallace Hatch. He looked different than he had at the earlier hearings. The polish was gone, the practiced calm stripped away. His eyes darted around the room, and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. He did not look at Silas when he entered. Judge Fitch called the session to order without ceremony. "Reverend Webb, you requested this hearing. What evidence do you have?" Webb stood and presented the documents one by one. He explained the Colorado investigation, the alias, the labor camp, the death of the child, the flight from justice. He read the affidavit aloud, his voice steady and clear, and the room listened in absolute silence. When he finished, Judge Fitch looked at Hatch. "Mr. Hatch, do you have anything to say?" Hatch rose slowly. His face was gray, but his voice was still controlled. "Your Honor, these accusations are old and unsubstantiated. I left Colorado for personal reasons, not legal ones. The documents Reverend Webb has presented are hearsay and speculation. There is no conviction on my record. I am entitled to the presumption of innocence." "In Colorado, perhaps," Judge Fitch said, his voice cold. "But this is Wyoming, and I am the law here. The evidence before me suggests that you are a fugitive from justice, that you attempted to secure custody of 2 minor children through fraudulent means, and that you have engaged in a pattern of intimidation and harassment against Mr. Cain and the Dowell girls." He picked up a paper and signed it. "I am issuing an order for your immediate arrest on charges of fraud, attempted kidnapping, and unlawful coercion. You will be held in territorial custody until authorities from Colorado can arrange for your extradition." Hatch's composure broke. "You can't do this. I have rights. I have money. I have—" "You have nothing," Judge Fitch interrupted. "Deputy Morrow, take him into custody." Morrow stepped forward and took Hatch by the arm. Hatch pulled away, his eyes wild, his voice rising. "This isn't over, you hear me? I have friends. I have connections. You'll regret this." "I regret nothing," Morrow said, and he led Hatch out of the room. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Silas stood still, watching the door through which Hatch had disappeared. He felt a release, a loosening of the tension that had been wound tight in his chest for days. But it was not complete. Hatch was gone, but the damage he had done lingered. Clara came to stand beside him. "It's over," she said. "For now," Silas said. "But he'll have left marks. The water rights claim is still there. The fire is still there." "We'll fix it," she said, "together." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that they could. They left the registry office and found Webb waiting for them on the boardwalk. He looked tired, but there was a serenity in his face that had not been there before. "Mr. Cain," he said, "I'll need to stay in town for a few days to finalize the extradition paperwork, but I think it's safe to say that Clara and Lily are no longer in immediate danger." Silas nodded. "Thank you, Reverend, for everything." Webb shook his hand. "I did what Thomas would have done." He looked at Clara. "I'll come by the ranch before I leave for Cheyenne. We'll talk about the guardianship." Clara nodded, and then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward and hugged Webb. It was brief, almost awkward, but it was real. Webb's eyes glistened. "Your father would be proud of you, Clara." She did not answer. She just turned and walked to the wagon, and Silas followed. That evening they sat on the porch of the ranch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was cooler now, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere in the distance. Lily was already inside, asleep with Hector curled at her feet. Clara sat on the step beside Silas, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Silas," she said. "Yeah, I'm scared." He looked at her. "Of what?" "Of this feeling." She gestured vaguely at the ranch, at the sky, at everything. "Of believing that it's going to be all right. Every time I've believed that before, something happened to take it away." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know that feeling. I lived with it for 4 years after Sarah and Daniel died. I told myself that hope was a trap, that the only way to survive was to stop wanting things. But you didn't stop." "No," he said, "I didn't. Not because I was brave, because I couldn't. Because wanting things is part of being alive. You can't shut it off completely without shutting off everything else." Clara looked at him. "Is that why you bought us?" "Because you couldn't stop wanting?" He considered the question. "I bought you because I saw someone who had given up. And I knew that person. I knew how hard it was to come back from that place. I figured if I could give you a reason to keep going, maybe I'd find one for myself too." She was silent for a long time. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment, and said, "I think we're going to be all right." And for the first time, Silas believed it too. Inside the house, the lamp burned low, casting shadows across the walls. Lily slept soundly, Martha tucked under her arm. In the yard, the horses shifted in their stalls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out and was answered by another. The ranch was quiet, still, battered but standing. But as Silas sat on the porch beside Clara, he could not shake the feeling that this was not the end. Hatch was in custody, but his foreman, Briggs, was still out there. The water rights claim was still pending. There were loose ends that would need to be tied, wounds that would need to heal. They had survived the storm, but the aftermath would require just as much strength, and Silas was ready for it. The morning after Hatch's arrest arrived draped in a quiet that felt different from the silence of the days before, less like a held breath and more like the first exhalation after a long ordeal. Silas woke in his chair by the window, the rifle still across his knees, the gray light of dawn seeping through the glass. He had not meant to sleep, but the exhaustion of the past week had finally pulled him under sometime in the small hours, and he had slipped into a restless doze filled with fragments of fire and courtrooms and Clara's face in the moonlight. He stood slowly, working the stiffness out of his shoulders, and looked out at the yard. The charred remains of the henhouse were a dark scar against the pale grass, and the sight of it sent a fresh pulse of anger through him, but he pushed it down. Anger would not rebuild anything. He needed to move forward, to show Clara and Lily that this place could still be a home, even with the marks of violence upon it. He found Clara already awake, standing at the stove, her back to him. She did not turn when he entered, but she spoke. Water rights claim was withdrawn this morning. Deputy Morrow rode out at first light to tell us. Said Hatch's lawyer filed the withdrawal before the arrest even went through. Silas stopped. Why would he do that? Because Judge Fitch told him it was the only way to avoid additional charges of land fraud. Hatch's lawyer is trying to salvage what he can. She turned, and her face was calm, but there was something underneath it, a wariness that had not been there the night before. It's over, Silas. The legal part, anyway. He heard the hesitation in her voice. But Briggs is still out there. Morrow said they searched for him this morning, but he was gone. Rode out sometime last night, probably heading back to Colorado or wherever Hatch's people came from. She paused. Or maybe he's just waiting. Silas walked to the table and sat down. The coffee was hot, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into his fingers. If he's smart, he's gone for good. And if he's not smart, then we deal with him when he shows up. Clara sat across from him. She had the look of someone who had been turning something over in her mind for hours and had finally decided to say it out loud. I've been thinking about what Reverend Webb said, about the guardianship, about what happens next. Silas waited. He asked me, before he left for Cheyenne, whether I wanted him to pursue full guardianship and take us back with him, or whether I wanted to stay here, with you. What did you tell him? I told him I needed to think about it. She looked down at her hands. I've been thinking. Silas did not push. He had learned that Clara would speak when she was ready and not before. Lily is happy here, she said. She sleeps through the night. She talks about Hector and the horses and the chickens, even though the chickens are gone. She started to laugh again, really laugh. Not the kind she did at Uncle Harlan's because she thought she was supposed to. She looked up at him. I don't know how to be a child anymore. I forgot how, somewhere along the way, but watching her, I think maybe I could learn again. If I stayed. Silas set his coffee down. Clara, I'm not going to ask you to stay. I'm not going to ask you to leave. This has to be your choice, yours and Lily's. What do you want? The question was simple, direct, and it cut through all the careful walls he had built around himself. He looked at her, at this girl who had walked out of a burning past and into his quiet, empty life, and he told her the truth. I want you to stay, he said. I want to watch Lily grow up. I want to teach you both how to ride August, if you haven't already figured it out on your own. I want to rebuild that chicken coop and get new hens, and listen to Lily name every single one of them. I want to sit on this porch when I'm old, and remember the summer that two girls showed up and changed everything. Clara's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She nodded once, a short, firm motion. Then we'll stay. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the words settling around them like a blanket. Then Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, Martha dragging behind her by one arm. "Is it morning?" she asked. "It is," Clara said. "Is the bad man gone?" "He's gone," Silas said. "He's not coming back." Lily considered this with the solemnity of a 7-year-old who had learned that promises from adults were not always reliable. Then she climbed onto the bench beside Silas and leaned her head against his arm, and he felt the small weight of her trust settle into him like something precious and fragile. "Good," she said. "Now we can get new chickens." Silas laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in 4 years, and it sounded rusty and strange, but it was real. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Silas hitched the wagon and took Clara into town to buy lumber for the new henhouse, leaving Lily with Ruth Garnett, who had insisted on helping however she could. At Fletcher's Supply, Chet Briggs, no relation to the foreman, met them with a warmth that had not been there before. "Heard the news," he said. "Glad it worked out, Silas. You did right by those girls." Silas loaded the lumber into the wagon, while Clara picked out nails and hinges with a careful economy that reminded him of Sarah, and the thought came to him gently, without the usual sting of grief, like the memory of a warm day in winter. They were about to leave when Deputy Morrow appeared in the doorway of the supply store. His face was serious, and Silas's stomach tightened. "Silas," Morrow said, "got word from Cheyenne. Hatch escaped custody last night." The words hit like a fist. "Escaped?" "Killed a guard and slipped out the back of the holding cell sometime around midnight. They found the guard dead this morning. Hatch is gone." Clara stepped forward, her face pale. "Where is he?" "They don't know. He could be heading back here, or he could be running for the mountains. But I wanted you to know so you could be ready." Silas looked at Clara. Her jaw was set, but her hands were trembling. "We'll be ready," he said. They drove home in silence, the lumber rattling in the wagon bed, the weight of the news pressing down on them. When they reached the ranch, Silas did not unload the wood. He went straight to the barn and checked the rifle, then checked the shotgun he kept behind the door of the house. Clara stood in the doorway watching him. "What do we do?" "We keep living," he said. "We rebuild the hen house. We take care of the horses. We go about our business. But we stay watchful. And if Hatch shows up here, we don't give him a second chance." She nodded, and they set to work. The afternoon was spent under the hot sun, Silas sawing and hammering while Clara held board steady and fetched nails. The physical work was a balm, a way to keep their hands busy while their minds circled around the threat that lurked somewhere beyond the hills. Lily returned from Ruth Garnett's in the late afternoon, and she helped by carrying small pieces of scrap wood and announcing each completed section with great ceremony. By evening, the frame of the new henhouse was standing. It was not finished, but it was a start, and that was enough. Supper was quiet, the three of them sitting around the table in the lamplight, the windows dark, the night pressing in around them. Lily fell asleep at the table halfway through her meal, and Clara carried her to bed with a tenderness that made Silas's chest ache. When she came back, she sat down across from him and said, "He's going to come here." "Probably. He's not going to give up. Not after everything." "No." She looked at him, and her eyes were steady. "Then we need to be ready." They talked late into the night, planning, preparing. Silas showed Clara where he kept the extra ammunition. He taught her how to load the shotgun, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to aim in the dark. She learned quickly, the way she learned everything, with a focused intensity that left no room for error. When they were done, she set the shotgun by the back door and said, "I'll take the first watch." "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He nodded, and he did not argue. Silas slept in his chair again, the rifle across his knees, one ear tuned to the sounds of the night. Clara sat on the porch with the shotgun, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the dark line of the trail. The hours passed slowly, the moon tracing its arc across the sky, the coyotes calling in the distance. Nothing happened. The next morning, Silas woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Lily's laughter. Clara had made breakfast, and they ate together in the pale light of dawn, the thread of hatch hanging over them but not breaking them. 2 more days passed in this uneasy rhythm. Work by day, watchfulness by night. The henhouse was finished, and Silas ordered new hens from a farm 20 miles away. Lily named them before they arrived: Henrietta, Penelope, Mabel, and Gertrude. Clara rolled her eyes but wrote the names down on a scrap of paper and tacked it to the barn wall. On the 3rd night, Silas was sitting on the porch, the rifle resting against the rail, when he heard the sound of a horse on the trail. It was not a gallop, not a trot. It was a walk, slow and deliberate, the gait of someone who was not trying to hide. He stood and moved to the edge of the porch, his hand on the rifle, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. The moon was half full, casting enough light to pick out shapes but not details. The rider stopped at the fence line. "Mr. Cain," a voice said. It was not Hatch, it was Briggs. Silas did not answer. He raised the rifle and sighted down the barrel at the dark shape. Briggs laughed, low and dry. "Easy now. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to deliver a message." "Deliver it and go. Mr. Hatch wanted me to tell you that this is not over. He lost a battle, but he's going to win the war. He says to enjoy your time with the girls while you can. He'll be back." Silas pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, loud and final, and the bullet struck the fence post inches from Briggs's hand. The horse reared, and Briggs cursed, struggling to control it. "That was a warning," Silas said, his voice flat, carrying across the yard. "Next time, I won't aim for the fence." Briggs stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode off at a gallop, the sound of hooves fading into the dark. Silas stood on the porch, the rifle still raised, his heart pounding. Clara appeared behind him, the shotgun in her hands, her face white. Was that him? Briggs. He came to deliver a threat. Where is he now? Gone, for now. They stood together on the porch, the night settling around them, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Lily's voice came from inside, small and scared. "Silas? What happened?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Clara called back, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Go back to sleep." They did not sleep again that night. They sat together in the dark, watching the trail, waiting for a return that did not come. And when dawn finally broke, they were still there, tired but unbroken, ready for whatever came next. But the threat was still out there, coiled and waiting, and Silas knew that the final confrontation with Wallace Hatch had not yet been written. It was coming. And when it came, he intended to be the one still standing. The morning after the warning shot arrived, wrapped in a heavy stillness that felt like the calm before a storm, the air thick with humidity, and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the hills. Silas had not slept. He had sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees until the first pale light began to seep over the eastern ridges, and then he had stood and walked the perimeter of the property, checking every shadow, every fence post, every place where a man could hide. He found nothing. The trail was empty, the yard undisturbed, the only sound the uneasy shifting of the horses in the barn. Clara came out with a cup of coffee, her face pale from a night spent staring at the ceiling, and handed it to him without a word. He took it and nodded his thanks, and they stood together on the porch, watching the horizon as the thunder rolled closer. "He's still out there," Clara said. "I know. What are we going to do?" Silas considered the question. He had been turning it over in his mind all night, running through scenarios, weighing options, calculating the odds. "We're not going to wait for him to come to us. I'm going into town. I'm going to talk to Morrow and Ed Garnett and anyone else who'll listen. We're going to put together a search party and find Hatch before he finds us." Clara looked at him. "What if he's already gone? What if he ran?" "Then we make sure he stays gone. But I don't think he ran. A man like Hatch doesn't run after he's threatened. He waits. He watches. And then he strikes when you least expect it. I'm coming with you." "No." "Silas." "No," he said again, softer this time. "I need you here with Lily. I need to know that someone I trust is watching the house. Can you do that?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded. He saddled August and rode out at a canter, the sky growing darker as the storm built in the west. By the time he reached Caldwell Flats, the first fat drops of rain had begun to fall, striking the dry earth and raising the smell of dust and wet stone. He found Morrow at the deputy's office, sitting at his desk with a cup of cold coffee and a look of grim determination. "Silas," Morrow said, standing as he entered, "I heard the shot last night. I was about to ride out. Briggs came by, delivered a threat from Hatch. Said he'd be back." Morrow's jaw tightened. "I've been trying to track him. The trail goes cold about 10 miles south of town. He's holed up somewhere, waiting. Then we find him." They spent the next hour organizing a search party. Ed Garnett volunteered immediately, as did 2 other ranchers who had heard about Hatch's background and wanted no part of his return. Chet Briggs, the storekeeper, not the foreman, offered supplies and a spare horse. May Tilson came by with a basket of food and a promise to watch over Clara and Lily if needed. By mid-morning, a group of 7 men had assembled in the rain, armed and ready. Silas stood with them at the edge of town, the rain soaking through his hat and running down his neck, and he felt a gratitude so deep it almost hurt. These were men who did not owe him anything. They were showing up because they believed in something larger than themselves. Morrow divided the group into 3 pairs and assigned search sectors. Silas rode with Ed Garnett, heading south along the creek where the trail had last been seen. The rain fell harder, turning the ground to mud, making tracking nearly impossible. They rode for hours, checking every gully, every abandoned line shack, every cluster of trees that could hide a man and a horse. They found nothing. By late afternoon, the rain had slackened to a drizzle, and the light was beginning to fade. The search parties regrouped at a crossroads, weary and empty-handed. Morrow's face was drawn with frustration. "He's gone to ground," Morrow said. "Could be anywhere. Could be heading for the mountains." "He's not heading for the mountains," Silas said. "He's waiting. He wants to finish this. Then we need to draw him out." The words hung in the air, and Silas realized that Morrow was right. Hatch would not come out for a posse. He would only come out for the thing he wanted. "The girls," Silas said. "He'll come for the girls." Morrow looked at him. "Then we set a trap." The plan came together quickly. Morrow would take 2 men and set up a hidden watch around the ranch, concealed in the barn and the brush along the fence line. Silas would stay at the house with Clara and Lily, acting as bait. If Hatch or Briggs showed up, they would be surrounded before they could act. Silas rode back to the ranch in the fading light, the drizzle still falling, the sky a bruised purple overhead. He found Clara in the kitchen, Lily at the table drawing with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. He told them the plan, and Clara listened without interruption, her face composed. "Lily and I will stay inside," she said. "I've got the shotgun ready." "Good. Morrow and his men will be in position before dark. If anything happens, you stay low and let us handle it." Clara nodded, and then she did something that surprised him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold and small, but gripping with surprising strength. "Be careful," she said. "I will." The evening settled in, dark and damp, the clouds blocking any trace of moon or stars. Silas sat in the dark living room, the rifle across his knees, the window slightly open so he could hear the sounds of the night. Clara sat on the floor beside him, her back against the wall, the shotgun within reach. Lily was asleep in the back room, wrapped in blankets, with Martha tucked under her arm. The hours passed slowly. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. No horses. No footsteps. No voices. And then, just past midnight, Silas heard it. The soft creak of a saddle. The muffled step of a hoof on wet ground. He held up his hand to Clara, and she went still. He moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then a shape detached itself from the shadows near the barn. A man on foot, moving low and slow, a dark figure against the deeper dark. Silas raised the rifle and sighted through the window. He did not fire. He waited. The figure moved toward the house, and behind it another shape emerged from the tree line. 2 of them, Hatch and Briggs. They were coming in from opposite sides, trying to flank the house. Silas shifted his aim, then lowered the rifle. He had to let them get close enough that Morrow's men could close the trap. He heard a whistle from the direction of the barn, Morrow's signal. They were in position. The first figure, Briggs, reached the porch steps. Silas could see the scar on his jaw even in the dim light. Briggs had a pistol in his hand, and he was moving with the practiced stealth of a man who had done this before. He was 3 steps from the door when Morrow's voice cut through the night. "Hold it right there!" Briggs spun, raising his pistol, and the night exploded. 3 shots rang out from the barn, and Briggs crumpled, his pistol falling from his hand. He did not get up. From the other side of the house, there was a shout and the sound of running feet. Hatch had broken cover and was running for the tree line. Silas threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, raising the rifle. Hatch was 50 yards away, 30, 20, his boots pounding the wet grass. Silas fired. The shot went wide, kicking up mud to Hatch's left. Hatch did not stop. He was almost to the trees, almost to freedom, when a figure stepped out from behind a large oak, blocking his path. It was Ed Garnett. He had a shotgun leveled at Hatch's chest, and his voice was steady and cold. "That's far enough." Hatch skidded to a stop, his hands going up. He was breathing hard, his face twisted with rage and fear. "You don't know what you're doing. I have money. I can make you rich." "I don't want your money," Ed said. "I want you gone." Morrow came up from the barn, his pistol drawn, and 2 other men emerged from the shadows. They surrounded Hatch, and Morrow stepped forward and pulled his hands behind his back, securing them with a set of handcuffs. "Wallace Hatch," Morrow said, "you are under arrest for escape from custody, attempted kidnapping, and assault with a deadly weapon. You will be transported to Cheyenne under armed guard, and you will stand trial for everything you've done in Colorado and Wyoming." Hatch said nothing. His eyes found Silas, standing on the porch, and they held for a long moment. Then Morrow turned him and led him away. Silas stood there, the rifle hanging loose in his hand, the rain beginning to fall again, soft and cold against his face. He felt a release, a letting go of something he had been holding for days, weeks, years. It was over. Clara came to the door, the shotgun still in her hands. She looked at him, and her face was wet with rain or tears. He could not tell which. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over." They stood together on the porch, watching as Morrow and his men led Hatch and the body of Briggs away into the darkness. The rain washed over them, clean and steady, and the night began to clear, the clouds breaking apart to reveal a single bright star low on the horizon. Lily appeared in the doorway behind them, rubbing her eyes, Martha dangling from her hand. "What happened?" "Nothing," Clara said, turning to her and pulling her close. "Nothing bad. Go back to sleep." Lily looked at Silas, and he nodded. She yawned and padded back to her cot, and the house settled into a quiet that was different from before. It was the quiet of a storm finally past, of a weight finally lifted. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that makes you believe the world has been washed clean. Silas walked the yard, checking the spot where Briggs had fallen, finding only a dark stain on the grass that would fade with time. He walked to the barn and found August standing peacefully, his ears forward, his eyes calm. He walked to the new henhouse and saw that it had weathered the rain without a leak. He was standing there, looking out at the hills, when Clara came up beside him. She did not say anything at first. She just stood with him, her arms crossed, her hair loose in the morning breeze. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her. "I've been thinking a lot about what home means. When Mama and Papa were alive, home was a place where I felt safe. After they died, home became a word that didn't mean anything anymore. It was just a roof and 4 walls, and I was always waiting for the next bad thing to happen." She paused. "But here, with you, I stopped waiting. For the first time, I started living again." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright and clear. "This is home. Your home." Silas felt something break open inside him, something that had been sealed for so long he had forgotten it was there. He did not trust himself to speak, so he just put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the morning light. Later that morning, Deputy Morrow returned with news that Hatch had been handed over to federal marshals and was on his way to Cheyenne to face trial. The water rights claim had been officially withdrawn, and the ranch's title was clear. The threat was gone. Ed Garnett and the others came by to see how they were doing, and Ruth Garnett brought a basket of fresh bread and a jar of jam. May Tilson came with a bolt of fabric for new dresses for the girls. The ranch was filled with the sound of voices and laughter, the kind of sound that Silas had not heard in 4 years. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Lily was asleep, Silas and Clara sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of wet earth and new grass. "Silas," Clara said. "Yeah, I think I'm ready to stop running now." He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm glad," he said. She turned to him, and there was a smile on her face, small and real, and full of something that looked like hope. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for letting me in." The sun dipped below the hills, and the stars began to appear, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky. Hector padded out of the house and curled up at Clara's feet, and they sat together in the quiet, watching the night settle around them. And in that moment, Silas Cain understood something that he had spent 4 years trying not to believe: that love was not a wound. That opening your heart to another person was not an invitation to loss. That the frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where a man could start again, where a family could be built from nothing but choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to let the world break you. He thought of Sarah, and he thought of Daniel. He thought of the years of silence and solitude, and he knew that they would always be a part of him. But he also knew that he was not the same man who had walked into Caldwell Flats a week ago. He was a man with a family, a man with a future, a man who had found a reason to keep going. He looked at Clara, and he thought about the journey that had brought them here. And he felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.